There is a way Space Marines are supposed to fight. You know the image. Drop pods crashing through atmosphere at the point of maximum enemy presence. The charge across open ground, the chaplain's voice rising above the noise of battle, calling the warriors forward into whatever is trying to stop them. The sound of it enough to make allies turn and stare, and enemies understand that the thing coming at them does not feel what they feel when they face it. The bolter line advancing in formation. The banner raised above the breach after the breach is taken. It is magnificent. The Imperium has needed magnificent warriors again and again for 10,000 years. But there is something underneath the magnificence that the most honest military thinkers in the Adaptus Astartes have always understood. Something the pageantry does not address. Something the chaplain's speech and the drop pod assault and the heroic charge simply do not help with, and sometimes make worse. Most wars are not won by the magnificent charge. Most wars are won by a warrior in the right position at the right moment, whose enemy does not know he is there. By information about the enemy's movements gathered hours before the battle begins rather than improvised during it. By the strategic withdrawal that preserves fighting strength for a counterstrike rather than the honourable stand that spends it against an objective that was never worth the price. By the willingness to let the enemy believe he is winning, just long enough, just far enough, that the trap closes and his confidence becomes the instrument of his destruction. Most wars are won by patience and concealment and the application of overwhelming force at a moment of your own choosing rather than your enemy's. The Raptors understand this. They understand it in the particular way that some warriors understand the mechanics of the thing others simply do. Not because they received a different education, not because their gene seed carries some quality the other chapters lack, but because at some point early in their history they looked at how Space Marines were expected to fight and made a decision. They decided that winning mattered more than looking like a Space Marine while they did it. This makes them uncomfortable to serve alongside. Other chapters find them unsettling in ways they sometimes cannot articulate. A general impression that something is slightly off about the warriors in the olive armor. Something reserved and watchful that does not fit the template. The Raptors do not announce their presence. They do not seek glory. Their chapter master is described by those who have met him as possessing the most unsettling pair of eyes in the Adaptus Astartes. Dark and still and calculating, always apparently counting something. The chapter is called the Raptors. The name refers to the hunting bird, the creature that does not charge its prey in the open air, wings spread and cry sounding, but circles in silence at altitude until the moment arrives. Then it falls at a speed that leaves no time for the prey to respond. The strike comes from where the prey was not looking. The kill is over before it becomes a fight. That is the principle. That is the chapter in a word. They carry the gene seed of Corvus Corax, the Primarch of Shadows, the commander who survived a massacre by learning to move through darkness in ways the enemy had no framework for. The Raven Guard's inheritance is concealment and precision, and the virtue of fighting on your own terms rather than the enemy's. The Raptors took that inheritance and compressed it, stripped away the ceremonial elements and the mythological trappings, and arrived at something leaner, colder, and considerably more effective. They are not famous. This is also intentional. A famous chapter attracts attention. Attention shapes the enemy's response. A chapter that has developed a recognizable tactical signature will eventually fight enemies who have studied it, who have prepared for it, who have removed the advantages it exploits. The Raptors are not interested in being famous enough to be prepared for. They want to arrive where the enemy was not expecting a force to arrive, in the manner the enemy was not expecting, and do what needs to be done before anyone can adjust. They are very good at it. This is their story, not a story of spectacular charges or heroic last stands, or the kind of moments that fill Crusade records and get cited by administratum scholars. The Raptor's story is quieter than that, and stranger, and in some ways considerably darker. It is the story of a chapter that decided, a very long time ago, that the point of being a warrior is winning, and that anything which does not contribute to winning at the lowest possible cost is, at best, optional. The Imperium has always had a specific and terrible need for warriors who fight smarter than anyone else. What that has made of the Raptors is worth understanding. Every Space Marine chapter begins somewhere. A gene seed, a primarch, a founding decision that determines what the chapter is before any of its members have yet made a choice. The Raptors began with Corvus Corax. Corvus Corax is not the most celebrated of the Emperor's sons. This is partly because he does not celebrate himself. The Raven Guard and their successors share a distrust of spectacle that runs through their gene seed like a current. But the Primarch of the Raven Guard occupies a position in the mythology of the Horus heresy that is worth understanding, because the position is not about glory. It is about survival. The world that made Corax was a prison. He was raised on Lias, a barren moon, grey and lightless, its population enslaved to the mines that the overseers of Kievar below had decided were more valuable than the humanity of the people working them. Corax survived in this environment, grew in it, eventually led the rebellion that broke the prison's authority and freed its people. The specific qualities this produced in him are visible in everything that followed. The distrust of visible power, the preference for working within constraints rather than demanding they be removed, the understanding that the most effective resistance to an enemy's strength is not the strength that meets it head-on, but the strength that finds its way around it. He did not lead the Lycius rebellion with an army. He led it with organization, with patience, with the specific intelligence of someone who understood that the overseer's power was real, and that the path to defeating real power was not to contest it where it was strongest. He found the weak points. He acted on them with precision. When the rebellion finally struck, it struck in the way that Raptor's operations still strike, from the direction the enemy was not watching, at the moment the enemy was least able to respond. This is the inheritance, not mythological. Structural. At the drop site massacre on Istvan Fee, the Raven Guard were one of 3 legions caught in an ambush of catastrophic scale. The Iron Hands and the Salamanders were there too, and all 3 legions were hammered from 2 sides simultaneously, as the forces they had believed were reinforcing them turned their guns around. It was the worst day in the history of the Space Marine legions, and it was worst for Corax because the Raven Guard had been positioned where the second wave could reach them most efficiently. The Raven Guard were nearly destroyed. What was left of them was Corax's command, the ability to move through darkness, to evade pursuit, to pull what remained of his legion out of a killing ground that should have left no survivors. He managed it. Not through the kind of heroic last stand that other Primarchs might have chosen, through concealment and movement and the cold pragmatic decision that surviving to fight another day was more valuable than dying with honor in a position that could not be held. This decision saved what remained of the Raven Guard. It also shaped the spiritual inheritance of every chapter that would eventually descend from them. The Raptors were founded in the Second Founding, when the great legions were broken apart under the Codex Astartes. The Raven Guard was divided, and from its divisions new chapters were formed. The Raptors were among them. And the founding story that some sources attach to them, told apocryphally, not with the certainty of verified record, is one that fits their character so perfectly that it may be true, or may have become true over time in the way that stories do when they capture something essential. The founding members of the Raptors were, the account goes, warriors who had not yet completed their initiation at the time of the Dropsite massacre. Novitiates, not yet full members of the Legion, too young to fight at Istvan Fee, left behind when the Legion deployed. They survived the massacre not by fighting it, but by not being there, and they built the chapter from the ruins of a Legion that had learned, in the most brutal possible way, what happens when you march your warriors into a position you cannot hold, because the position looks like the honourable choice. Whether this is historically accurate is not the point. The point is what the story means to the Raptors themselves. The founding generation, in this account, grew up in the shadow of a catastrophe they did not witness and could not have prevented. They inherited a gene seed soaked in the lessons of Istvan V. And the lesson that soaking produced was not glory. It was never lose warriors to an objective you did not have to take. Never let the enemy choose the ground. Never let honor override arithmetic. These are not comfortable principles for an institution that has spent 10,000 years building its identity around the warrior virtues of courage and sacrifice, and the willingness to stand when everything says run. The Raptors absorbed those virtues, because they are Astartes and the virtues are structural. But they organized them differently. Courage in the Raptors' framework means the courage to be misunderstood by warriors who expect something else from you. Sacrifice means not spending warriors you do not need to spend. Standing, when the Raptors stand, means they have decided this is the right position and they are going to hold it, not because honor demands it, but because the arithmetic says it is worth holding. The difference between those two reasons for standing is subtle from the outside. From the inside, it is everything. A warrior who stands because honor demands it will stand even when the position has become untenable. A warrior who stands because the position is worth holding will reevaluate if that calculation changes. The Raptors reevaluate constantly against every new piece of information, every shift in the enemy's behavior, every development in a battle that the original plan did not account for. This is not indecisiveness. It is the opposite. The commitment to making the correct decision rather than the consistent one, which takes more discipline and more intelligence than simply executing a plan. Most chapters do not think this way. The Codex Astartes provides the plan, and the warriors execute it with whatever adaptation the situation demands. The Raptors use the Codex as a starting point and then ask what the situation actually requires. And if the answer diverges from the Codex, they follow the answer. This is what the Raven Guard heritage made of them, not a legion's martial glory compressed into a chapter's frame. a particular way of thinking about war that began in the grey moon of Lycaeus, deepened in the ashes of Istvan Fee, and has never stopped evolving. The Raptors have lost a homeworld. This is not the kind of loss that most Space Marine chapters have experienced, and the ones that have tend to carry the wound in different ways. For the Raptors, the loss was not catastrophic enough to destroy the chapter. They were not present when it happened, or not in the numbers that would have been destroyed with it. They were elsewhere, fighting other wars as Space Marine chapters are. Their first homeworld was close to the Eye of Terror, in the treacherous gravitational and warp-adjacent territory that surrounds the galaxy's greatest scar, and it was consumed by a chaos incursion during one of the earlier Black Crusades. When they came back, there was nothing to come back to. What the Raptors did with this, what they decided it meant, is one of the more revealing moments in their chapter history. They did not dedicate themselves to avenging the homeworld, which would have been an entirely comprehensible response. They did not build a mythology around the loss, turning it into the defining wound that shaped their identity in the way the Blood Angel's grief shapes theirs, or the Iron Hand's cold fury shapes theirs. They looked at what had happened, drew the lesson it contained, and adjusted accordingly. The lesson: a single homeworld is a liability. Not because homeworlds are bad. Most chapters maintain them, recruit from them, are shaped by them, and the relationship between a chapter and the world it calls its own is one of the more complex institutional bonds in the Adeptus Astartes. The homeworld provides recruits, provides physical and cultural grounding, provides the permanent installation from which the chapter can operate and to which it can return. But a single homeworld is also a single point of failure, a target. Something that, if the enemy identifies it and reaches it and destroys it, removes at a stroke everything the chapter has built around itself. The Raptors had just demonstrated this. They had had a homeworld, and then they hadn't, and the chapter had survived only because the chapter had not been home. Their response was to make the situation intentional. They eventually established a new homeworld, Tarangast, in the Sutter Spiral Nebula, but they wrapped it in a layer of institutional secrecy so thorough that the planet's location is unknown to most Imperial institutions that are not the Raptors themselves. They do not advertise where they live. They do not confirm or deny what is asked of them. The planet exists, and the chapter recruits from it, and trains on it. But the Raptors treat their homeworld the way they treat their tactical positions, as an asset that only has value if the enemy does not know where it is. Their fortress monastery is not on the planet anyway. The battle barge Accipiter serves as the chapter's mobile command and administrative center, a ship that can be moved. That does not depend on a fixed location remaining secure. That can carry the chapter's leadership and most critical assets away from any static position that becomes compromised. A chapter that makes its headquarters a starship has, by definition, decided that strategic mobility matters more than the prestige and permanence of a fixed installation. This is not what the Codex Astartes prescribes. The Codex expects fortress monasteries. It expects the chapter to be anchored to something. The Raptors are anchored to nothing they cannot carry. They maintain multiple recruiting worlds as well, for the same reason. Not just Tarangast, a distributed network of worlds from which candidates can be drawn, so that the destruction of any one of them does not eliminate the chapter's ability to replenish. The loss of the first homeworld was a lesson, and the Raptors integrated it into their planning with the same thoroughness they apply to everything else, by identifying the structural vulnerability that allowed the loss to be so complete and redesigning their arrangements to eliminate it. The Raptors do not commemorate the loss of their first homeworld in the way that some chapters might. There is no annual ceremony of mourning, no relic carried forward from the planet's final days, no mythological weight assigned to the destruction of the place they came from. They remember it the way you remember something that taught you an expensive lesson, with a specific functional awareness that shapes subsequent decisions. The homeworld is gone. The chapter is not. The chapter is what matters. And the chapter has arranged itself so that what happened to the homeworld cannot happen to the chapter. This is how the Raptors process catastrophe. Not with grief that calcifies into tradition, not with rage that defines their subsequent wars. With analysis and adjustment and the cold determination to ensure the next situation is structured differently. It makes them strange. It makes them hard to read for warriors from other chapters who expect catastrophic loss to be acknowledged at a certain volume. The Raptors grieve quietly, if at all, and move forward with the same considered pace they bring to everything. Efficient grief is still grief. But it looks very different from the outside. The Raptors do not believe in honor. This requires clarification, because stated plainly it is the kind of thing that will get a chapter declared excommunicate if the wrong inquisitor hears it said too loudly. The Raptors are loyal to the Emperor, absolutely and demonstrably, and they have bled for the Imperium on 100 fronts. What they reject is not the moral content of honor, the commitment to the Imperium, the protection of humanity, the willingness to sacrifice, but the form it is expected to take in battle. The form is the problem. Honourable battle, as the wider Adeptus Astartes understands it, has a shape. You engage the enemy directly, or at least overtly. You accept the risks that engagement carries. You do not use approaches that, if the situations were reversed, you would consider to be unfair: the attack from concealment, the feigned retreat designed to draw the enemy into a killing ground, the ambush that kills before the other side knows a battle has begun. These are the things that, when an alien force uses them against the Imperium's warriors, are described as treacherous. When your own forces use them, they are described as tactics. The Raptors have noticed this inconsistency, and their response to it is not to argue the philosophy in detail. They are warriors, not philosophers, and they do not spend significant time in ideological debate. Their response is to use every effective approach available to them, and to not apologize for it. Camouflage. Space Marines do not wear camouflage. This is a point of pride for most chapters. Their armor announces what they are, the chapter colors visible at distance. The presence of the Astartes itself a message sent to the enemy before a shot is fired. The message is, you are fighting, Space Marines. You should be afraid. There is value in this. Psychological impact is a real component of combat effectiveness, and the reputation of the Adeptus Astartes produces responses in enemy formations that can decide engagements before they begin. The Raptors will sometimes use this approach when it serves the mission, but they also will cover that armor in whatever pattern or color makes it disappear into the terrain. Because an enemy who does not know a Space Marine is in the tree line cannot respond to it. An enemy who is afraid is still responding. An enemy who is dead was not given the opportunity. This feels wrong to warriors raised in other traditions. The power armor is sacred, It carries machine spirits. It has been maintained across generations. It represents centuries of service and the accumulated identity of the warrior who wears it. Covering it in mud is not, in the cultural framework of most chapters, consistent with that sacredness. The Raptor's position is that the machine spirit's purpose is to help the warrior fight effectively. Camouflage helps the warrior fight effectively. Therefore, the logic is impeccable and the discomfort is real, and both of these things are true simultaneously. Strategic withdrawal is another area of difference. The Raptors plan for it, not simply as an emergency contingency, the option of last resort that commanders reach for when everything else has failed, but as an intentional element of battle plans from the beginning. A withdrawal planned before it is needed is a tool. A withdrawal that happens because the plan has failed is a disaster. The Raptors build the withdrawal into the plan. Keep it available. Execute it when the arithmetic says executing it is correct, and then reposition for the counterstrike that a planned withdrawal enables. Other chapters sometimes interpret this as cowardice. They are wrong, and the Raptors know they are wrong. And the Raptors have stopped arguing about it. You cannot persuade a warrior who has been trained to treat standing ground as a virtue that choosing your ground before you stand is the more courageous act. The persuasion takes too long, and the warrior will never fully believe it because it runs against the grain of his entire formation. What the Raptors can do is demonstrate by outcome that their methods produce results. The outcomes speak. Time and again they take objectives from enemies with superior numbers. Not always, not without cost, not as some magical formula that makes difficult things easy. But the pattern, across the chapter's history, is one of disproportionate effectiveness. A chapter that is not among the largest in the Adeptus Astartes, not the most heavily resourced, not fighting the most favorable conditions, but producing victories that larger and better equipped forces did not produce against the same opposition. Why? Because they are thinking, constantly, carefully, without the interruption of the kind of martial pride that can make a warrior take the difficult direct approach when a less obvious approach would achieve the same result with fewer losses. The Raptors' warriors are not less brave than those of other chapters. They are required to be brave in a way that is, if anything, more demanding. The discipline to take the effective approach rather than the impressive one when the impressive one feels like the right choice is a form of self-mastery that the heroic charge does not require. The chapter's rejection of glory-seeking is not weakness. It is the specific strength of a force that has never confused the appearance of effectiveness with effectiveness itself. And in a galaxy that has spent 10,000 years trying to kill what little remains of human civilization, a force that is actually effective, rather than one that looks like it should be effective, is more valuable than the Imperium has always been willing to admit. To watch the Raptors fight, if you can see them at all, which is not guaranteed, is to watch a different kind of war. They move early. Before the battle begins in the conventional sense, before the main engagement is joined, Raptor scouts are already in position throughout the operational area. Not simply forward scouts in the traditional sense of pickets pushed ahead of the main force to detect the enemy's approach. Something more thorough than that. Warriors positioned to observe the enemy's movement patterns, the locations of reserves, the placement of command assets and communication nodes. Warriors who have been in place long enough to know the rhythm of what they are watching. When patrols change, when attention drifts, where the gaps are between organized coverage. The battle, when the Raptors engage it, is already several steps old by the time the first shot is fired. This information advantage is the foundation that every tactical choice rests on. You cannot effectively plan an ambush without knowing where your target will be. You cannot effectively time a withdrawal without knowing the enemy's pursuit capacity. You cannot effectively identify the right moment for the decisive strike without understanding the enemy's operational cycle well enough to know when they are most exposed. The Raptors invest substantially in the gathering of this information, and they are willing to spend time on it that other chapters would spend in direct engagement. There is a phrase that circulates in accounts of the Raptors' campaigns, not official doctrine, just the observation of commanders who have fought alongside them or against them, that the Raptors never arrive at the same time as their reputation. The reputation precedes them. The warriors arrive later, from an unexpected direction, when the enemy has been watching the wrong approach. Their armor is olive drab, a dark earthy green that has no precedent in the martial tradition of most chapters, and that is designed to disappear into natural terrain. Not every engagement takes place in terrain where this matters. Void combat, urban fighting, the inside of a spacecraft have their own conditions. But where the terrain will hide them, the Raptors use it, and they develop the art of concealment with the same rigor that other chapters develop the art of direct assault. The Scout Marines who serve every chapter learn the basics of concealment as part of their training. The Raptors' warriors never stop refining it. They are exceptional marksmen. This follows from the philosophy in a direct way. A warrior who can engage the enemy at range, from concealment, before the enemy has identified his position, is a warrior who reduces the risk to himself while reducing the enemy's capability. The bolter is the standard weapon of the Adeptus Astartes, and the Raptors use it to its full effective range rather than closing to the distances where it becomes a weapon in a close combat. Lias Issodon himself is described as one of the finest shots in the chapter, which in a chapter that prizes marksmanship above almost everything else is a significant distinction. The ambush is central. Not every engagement is an ambush. The Raptors fight in every kind of tactical environment, including ones where concealment is impossible and the engagement is necessarily direct. But where the choice exists, the Raptors choose the ambush, and they have developed it to a level of sophistication that makes the comparison to other chapters' scouting and harassment tactics somewhat inadequate. A Raptor ambush is not a quick strike from cover before falling back. It is a complete engagement designed around the enemy's expected response to each stimulus, building through a series of phases that each produce the conditions for the next one. The enemy sees something, a small Raptor element apparently caught in the open, a target that looks attractive. The enemy responds. The response is what was planned for. The response is what draws the enemy into the position that allows the next element to engage from a different angle. The enemy adapts to the second engagement and is now drawn further into the kill zone. The pattern continues until the Raptors choose the moment for the decisive blow, which arrives when the enemy is fully committed, when the reserves have been spent responding to the diversions, when the command structure has been disrupted by the targeting of its key nodes. The last blow is not a blow the enemy sees coming. By the point it arrives, the enemy is already dead. They just haven't realized it yet. Against this, numbers matter less than other qualities. A larger force that is poorly positioned whose command is disrupted, whose reserves have been spent, whose communication lines have been cut, is less formidable than a small force in perfect coordination. The Raptors specialize in creating the conditions under which the enemy's size becomes irrelevant. They have fought and defeated forces many times their own strength, not through any mystical enhancement of their capability, but through the patient and rigorous application of a principle that military theory has understood for millennia. Surprise, mass, speed, delivered at the critical point. The key word is patient. The Raptors wait for the right moment with an equanimity that other chapters find difficult to match. There is no internal pressure toward engagement, no cultural preference for the battle over the vigil, no mythology about the warrior who waited too long and lost the chance for glory. The Raptors' cultural preference is for the battle that was fought correctly. And fighting correctly sometimes means watching the enemy until the watching reveals the opening. Then they move, quickly, decisively, without hesitation. The waiting is not passivity. It is pressure stored up, accumulating, held in place by discipline until the moment arrives when releasing it will do what it needs to do. Doctrine is the word that covers a lot of ground the Raptors traverse differently from other chapters. Most chapter doctrine is organized around a set of tactical principles that are applied with whatever adaptation the situation demands. Principles descended from the Codex Astartes, modified by the chapter's own history and the gene seed's specific qualities, refined through campaigns into something that works for the particular warriors and resources the chapter commands. The doctrine is the default. Combat adjusts it. The doctrine remains the foundation. Raptor's doctrine functions differently. The foundation is not a set of tactical principles, but a set of analytical questions. Before a principle is applied, the situation is interrogated. What does this objective actually require? What are the enemy's vulnerabilities and how do they rank by exploitability? What is the most expensive thing we could do here? And is there a less expensive path to the same outcome? What does the enemy believe about what we are going to do? And how does that belief create opportunities that honest signaling would not? From these questions, principles emerge. Not the same principles every time. The questions are the constant, and the principles that answer them are variable. This is what other commanders find difficult to anticipate about the Raptors. You cannot predict their tactical choices from their previous tactical choices, because their choices are generated by analysis of each situation rather than by habitual application of preferred methods. The chapter that fought one way in the Gargathia system will not necessarily fight the same way in the Sutter Spiral Nebula or on the fringe of the Great Rift, even against similar opponents. What you can predict is that they will have thought about it, that the approach they take will have been chosen from among alternatives, that the alternatives will have been evaluated against the conditions of the current situation, and that the chosen approach will represent their best considered conclusion about what this situation requires. The specific elements of their approach that appear most consistently across different theaters, the ones that represent the closest thing the Raptors have to fixed tactical preferences, are four. First, information before position. The Raptors almost never begin an engagement from a position they moved into without knowing what they were moving into. They gather what they can before they commit to ground, even at the cost of time that more aggressive chapters would spend moving toward the enemy. A position occupied with full information about the surrounding tactical environment is worth more than a position occupied faster with less knowledge of what surrounds it. Second, command pressure before force pressure. When possible, the Raptors identify and target the enemy's ability to direct its forces before they engage those forces directly. This does not mean assassination, though it can include it, as much as the disruption of the communication and coordination that makes a coherent military force out of its constituent units. An army whose command structure is degraded cannot respond to tactical developments as they occur, which means the Raptors can move through the battle's phases faster than the enemy can adjust. Third, the reserve held until the trap closes. The Raptors almost always keep a force uncommitted through the early phases of an engagement. Not because they are being cautious, they do not think of it in those terms, but because the uncommitted reserve is what exploits the opportunity that the initial engagement creates. The enemy who has committed fully to defeating the Raptors' initial engagement is the enemy who has no adjustment available when the reserve comes in from the unexpected direction at the unexpected moment. Fourth, withdraw before the cost exceeds the objective. The Raptors plan their withdrawal at the same time they plan their advance, and they execute it without the psychological resistance that other chapters feel when falling back from a committed position. The withdrawal is a tactical choice like any other tactical choice. It is taken when the analysis indicates it produces better outcomes than continuing. And it is executed cleanly and without the rearguard hesitation that unnecessary pride produces. These four elements appear across the chapter's history in different combinations. They are not a formula. No formula survives contact with the variety of situations the Raptors have found themselves in over their long history. They are orientations, dispositions, the shape that disciplined engagement with a military problem tends to produce when the analyst comes from the Raptors tradition. They work because they are grounded in what actually determines the outcome of engagements rather than what determines the drama of them. Information wins, command disruption wins, reserves win, strategic mobility wins. These are not revolutionary insights. They appear in military theory texts that are centuries old and that any educated Imperial commander would have read. The Raptors do not claim originality. What they claim is execution. And what they execute, consistently and under pressure, and against enemies who are often aware of what the Raptors are likely to do and cannot stop them doing it, is the most complete and disciplined application of what the theory says should work that the Adaptus Astartes has ever produced. The gap between understanding a principle and executing it reliably under combat pressure is where most military forces live. The Raptors have narrowed that gap as far as it can be narrowed. The doctrine they hold is the doctrine they deliver. This is rarer than it sounds, and it is worth considerably more than it looks like from outside the engagement. His nickname within the chapter is the Grim, among warriors not known for their warmth, among a chapter that prizes taciturnity and reserves expression for the moments that genuinely require it. This distinction says something about the man. Lias Issodon is the chapter master of the Raptors, and he has held the position through decades of some of the most demanding combat the Adaptus Astartes has faced in the 41st millennium. He is, by the accounts of commanders who have fought alongside him, and enemies who have survived an engagement with his forces, the clearest expression of what the Raptors are, not because he represents the average of the chapter, but because he represents its furthest point in the direction the chapter has always been moving. He communicates sparingly, This is not shyness or incapacity. Issodon is a strategic thinker of considerable sophistication, and when he does speak, the precision of what he says makes the brevity look like the most efficient possible use of language. He simply does not speak when speech is not necessary, which is more of the time than most commanders are comfortable with. A briefing conducted by Issodon is not an inspiring address. It is an exchange of the information required to execute the mission, organized in the sequence that makes the information most useful, without embellishment. The effect on people who expect something more theatrical from a chapter master is profound, and not always comfortable. Outsiders describe a quality in his stillness that they struggle to characterize accurately. Not dangerous exactly, or not only dangerous. Something more specific. The stillness of something that is always watching, always calculating, always somewhere in the middle of a sequence of thinking that you cannot see and that may or may not include you as a relevant variable. His subordinates find this reassuring. Within the chapter, the quality of his attention is understood to mean that when Issodon's planning indicates a certain course of action, it has already accounted for the failure modes that a less careful mind would encounter later. His silence before an engagement is not uncertainty. It is the final stages of processing that he conducts more efficiently without external noise. He is also one of the best shots in the chapter. This matters. For a chapter master, it would be possible to be an exceptional strategist without being an exceptional warrior, to lead by plan rather than by presence, to conduct operations from the strategically correct remove. Issodon does not choose this. He is present in the field, in positions where his marksmanship can be applied, in the engagement as well as the planning of it. There is something in this that the Raptor's warriors respond to beyond the tactical value of a chapter master who can put a round through a target at extreme range. It is the evidence that the man who designed the operation understands what it costs from the inside. His first significant appearance in the wider Imperium's records predates the Badab War. His performance in the Fourth Quadrant Rebellion brought him to the attention of command hierarchies that had not previously known enough about the Raptors to know they should be paying attention to their chapter master. The Fourth Quadrant Rebellion was not a small conflict, and the conditions it presented were exactly those in which the Raptors' approach distinguished itself most clearly: irregular, distributed, against forces that could not be engaged effectively on their own terms, but that could be disrupted and systematically dismantled by an opponent with sufficient patience and intelligence. Issodon approached it the way he approaches everything. He gathered information. He identified the critical nodes, the personalities, the supply chains, the communication patterns that held the rebellion together. He designed a campaign around degrading those nodes rather than engaging the rebellion's military force directly, which would have been expensive and slow and would have left the underlying structure intact to regenerate the force even when individual battles were won. The rebellion was dismantled. Not in the dramatic fashion of a decisive battle, but in the methodical fashion of a campaign conducted against the right targets in the right sequence. When the force that should have held the rebellion together was gone, the rebellion was gone, and the fighting was already over. This is Issodon's signature. Not the brilliant battle, but the campaign that ends before the battle it was building toward. The operation that solves the problem at the level before the problem becomes a battle. The plan that makes the obvious move unnecessary because the less obvious sequence of moves has already produced the required result. He offered himself for command of the combined loyalist force during the Badab War. The position went to Carab Cullen of the Red Scorpions instead, and the decision produced no resentment. At least none that is visible in the records. The Raptors continued to fight, and fight effectively under a command arrangement they had not chosen, and the relationship between Issodon and Cullen developed into something approaching a genuine partnership over the course of the war. This too is revealing. A chapter master who had built his identity around his own tactical genius, and who had been passed over for the senior command position would, in the tradition of many chapters, have managed the situation less cleanly. Issodon's response was to serve the mission under whoever the mission required to lead it, because the operation was the point and the command arrangement was simply how it got done. No one who has served beside him describes the experience as warm. Every one of them describes it as effective. The Badab War is one of the most significant internal conflicts in the Imperium's recent history, and one of the most instructive. It is instructive not primarily because of what it demonstrates about war in the abstract, but because of what it demonstrates about the Adeptus Astartes specifically, about what happens when the warriors the Imperium built to defend it turn their capabilities against each other. The war began with the Astral Claws, the Space Marine chapter that held the Badab sector, and their chapter master Lufgat Huron, who would become something considerably worse before the war was done, but who began it as a commander with a grievance that was not entirely illegitimate. Huron had concluded that the Badab sector was not receiving adequate protection, and that the tithes and support he was meant to receive were not coming. His response to this was to withhold the sector's own tithes in return. The Inquisition responded. The situation escalated. By the time the escalation had run its course, Huron had positioned himself as the head of a significant secessionist force, the Astral Claws, joined by the Mantis Warriors, the Lamenters, and the Executioners chapters, along with various mercenary and piratical forces that had found the Maelstrom Zone hospitable to their operations. Against them, the Imperium assembled a loyalist coalition. The Raptors were among the first to answer the call. The Inquisitor Legate Jandis Frayne put out the request in 906.M41, and Issodon deployed 4 companies to the war zone, the 2nd, the 5th, and the 6th, bolstered by assault reserves and scouts. The fleet that carried them included the battle barge War Talon, the strike cruisers Arius Vex and Shadowstalker, and 10 Gladius-class frigates. It was a substantial commitment, fully deployed under the direct command of the chapter master. They arrived alongside the Red Scorpions, the Fire Angels, and the Salamanders. Other chapters would join as the war developed. In those early months, the Loyalist coalition was assembling, learning what it faced, and determining how to address it. The Badab War was going to test the Raptors differently than most conflicts they had entered. The secessionist forces were not simple enemies. They were, in many cases, the same kind of warriors the Raptors were, Adeptus Astartes, operating with the same fundamental training and capability, thinking about war with the same deep understanding of Space Marine doctrine that made any assumption of easy advantage dangerous. You could not simply be better Space Marines than the Astral Claws and expect that to be sufficient. You needed to be smarter, or to get there first, or to find angles of approach that the secessionist force's own strengths did not cover. For the Raptors, this was the kind of challenge they had been designed for. Against alien enemies or human rebels or the standard military forces that most of the Imperium's campaigns involved, there was always the possibility of a capability gap. The Astartes warrior superior in individual terms to almost anything else on the battlefield. Against other Space Marines, that gap closed. What remained as differentiators were intelligence, positioning, and the quality of tactical thinking. The Raptors were not at a disadvantage in any of these. The first phase of their deployment was intelligence intensive. Before major offensive operations, the Raptors moved their scout elements through the contested areas of the Maelstrom Zone, building the picture of what they faced with the same patience they brought to every operational theater. The secessionist forces were not the disorganized rabble that some rebellions presented. They had defensible positions, established logistics, and command structures that had been months in the building. The Raptors recorded everything. What the intelligence gathering revealed about the Mantis warriors, the chapter that would prove to be the Raptors' most direct opponent in the war, was particularly valuable. The Mantis warriors were secessionist forces, and they were also warriors who had developed over centuries fighting the threats of the Maelstrom Zone, a style of war that looked unnervingly similar to the Raptors' own. Their gene seed traced back to the White Scars through the Marauders chapter, and what the White Scars' tradition of fast, aggressive hit and run raids had become under the grinding conditions of the Maelstrom, patient, terrain-focused, ambush-heavy, was a doctrine that the Raptors would recognize and could not simply outrun. Fighting them would require the Raptors to not simply apply their standard approach, but to apply it with awareness that the enemy was going to be watching for exactly that approach. This was not daunting. It was, for a chapter that thrives on the tactical problem, almost interesting. The war was going to be complex, expensive, and difficult. The Raptors arrived knowing all three of these things, and they arrived prepared for all three of them. What they could not know yet was how expensive it was going to become. The worst of it came in the Gargathia system. The Gargathia system was a contested zone where the secessionist forces had concentrated significant strength, and where the Loyalist campaign reached its most brutal phase. The Raptors were at the center of it. They saw more of the heaviest fighting during the Badab War than any other commitment would have predicted when the chapter deployed. Not because the plan had failed, but because the plan was working. And the plans that work in wars like this are the plans that go toward the fighting rather than around it. The Mantis warriors were there, and the Mantis warriors were everything the intelligence gathering had suggested they would be, and slightly more. The Mantis warriors had spent centuries fighting in the Maelstrom Zone, and what that environment had made of them was a doctrine that the Raptors recognized without having shared its origins. Their gene seed ran back to the White Scars through the Marauders chapter, but White Scars' dash and destroy raids had been transformed by the Maelstrom's terrain and its enemies into something slower, deeper, more patient. Ambush over assault, concealment over speed, the prepared killing ground over the cavalry charge. Fighting them meant fighting a force that understood exactly what the Raptors were going to do. Because the Mantis warriors had arrived at the same principles from a different starting point. An opponent who was watching the same angles, whose infiltration would be running simultaneously with the Raptors, who would not be drawn by a feint because they had used the same feint themselves. The engagements in the Gargathia system were not the clean sequenced operations the Raptors preferred. They were grinding, close, costly. Two sets of exceptional warriors fighting each other in conditions where the usual advantages of the ambush had been neutralized by the fact that both sides were looking for it. This is the core problem when warrior traditions converge. Most enemies the Raptors face do not know what they are facing when they encounter the chapter. They have not anticipated the concealment, the patience, the way an engagement arrives from the position that was not being watched. Against those enemies, the information asymmetry is decisive. The Raptors know what they are going to do. The enemy does not. The Mantis warriors knew. They had the same heritage, the same gene seed inheritance from Corvus Corax's line, the same institutional memory of the approaches that produce the most effective results against conventionally minded opponents. When a Raptor's element established a concealed observation position to gather intelligence before committing, there was a Mantis warrior's element aware that this was the Raptor's method and looking for the observation position. When a Raptor's withdrawal began, designed to draw the Mantis warriors into a prepared killing ground, the Mantis warriors assessed the withdrawal and were not drawn. When the Raptors identified a command node to disrupt as the opening move of a sequence, the Mantis warriors had already moved the command node and substituted a decoy. It was a war fought by warriors who understood each other too well for either side's standard approach to work cleanly. And in a war like that, what determines the outcome is the capacity to adapt faster than the opponent. To recognize that the standard approach is being countered, to generate the counter to the counter, and to execute it before the opponent has generated their own. The Raptors adapted. They are very good at adapting. But the Mantis warriors adapted too, and the result was a campaign of attritional intensity that the Raptors' planning had not fully anticipated. This is one of the harder things to understand about the Raptors' approach. The tactical philosophy that makes them extraordinarily effective against conventional enemies becomes less decisive against opponents who share the same fundamental doctrine. The Raptors can outthink an enemy that is operating on different assumptions. Against an enemy operating on similar assumptions, the conflict becomes a test of who executes better under pressure, and who can adapt fastest when the initial plan encounters the opponent's counter. The losses were severe. By the time the fighting in the Gargathia system reached its decisive phase, the Raptors had lost between 35 and 60% of their deployed strength, a casualty rate that spans a significant range because the records are imprecise. But that at either end represents a catastrophic commitment. The strike cruiser Arius Vex was destroyed. Warriors who had fought for the chapter across decades were gone, in engagements that the Raptors' doctrine should have managed with lower losses, and that proved more expensive than any analysis going in had predicted. This is not a failure of the philosophy. It is a demonstration that even the most effective tactical approach operates within conditions it cannot fully control. The Mantis warriors did not fall to the Raptors' methods because they understood the methods. The Raptors absorbed this lesson and kept fighting because the mission required it, and because the alternative, withdrawing from a campaign that had become expensive, would have left a strategic position that needed to be held without the force that was holding it. They held the position. The fighting in the Gargathia system eventually resolved in the Loyalists' favor, and the Raptors' ability to match the Mantis warriors' approach, not to defeat it decisively, but to understand it, counter it move for move, and outlast it, was a significant factor in the outcome. Gargathia III fell to the Loyalists. The cost had been enormous. The chapter that deployed 4 companies and their reserves came home with a fraction of what it had brought. The losses would take years, possibly decades, to rebuild to the levels the chapter needed to maintain its operational capacity. And yet the records of the Badab War do not describe the Raptors as damaged. They describe them as effective. The chapter that entered the Badab War as a force the wider Imperium did not know particularly well emerged from it as one that the commanders who had fought alongside them spoke of with a quality of respect that is different from the admiration usually directed at spectacular performance. It was more considered, more careful. The respect of people who had watched a chapter operate under maximum pressure and noticed that the approach held and adapted and produced the outcomes required. Not without cost. Never without cost. But the method did what it was supposed to do. The Raptors do not celebrate the Badab War. They do not have ceremonies to mark its worst moments. No mythology built around the warriors who died in the Gargathia system. They remember it as the chapter remembers everything. As data, as lessons, as the evidence base from which subsequent planning is developed. The warriors are gone. The lessons are applied. The next campaign is planned with the understanding of what the Mantis warriors demonstrated that the intelligence had not predicted. That is how the Raptors mourn. Quietly and practically, and in a way that ensures the sacrifice produced more than just the cost. Spending time with the Raptors produces reactions in other Space Marine warriors that the Raptors themselves find mildly curious and not particularly important. The reactions cluster around a few consistent themes. Discomfort with the silence. Unease at the watchfulness, a quality of interaction that feels less like two warriors operating in the same institutional framework, and more like being assessed by something that has not yet revealed its assessment. The olive armor that fades into terrain. The willingness to discuss withdrawal as a tactical option rather than a last resort. The absence of the chapter cult behaviors that every other Astartes force develops and maintains. The ceremonies, the battle cries, the mythological scaffolding that most chapters build around their identity. What are they without it? That is the question. A Space Marine chapter is its culture as much as its warriors. And the culture provides structure that the fighting itself cannot. The stories that make sense of sacrifice. The rituals that mark time and transition and the movement from one phase of a warrior's life to another. The specific mythology that makes a chapter's history feel continuous, meaningful, pointed towards something beyond the next engagement. The Raptors have all of this. It simply looks different. Their mythology is not heroic narrative, it is institutional memory. The lessons of the lost homeworld. The tactical principles that emerged from the drop site massacre's shadow. The case studies that constitute the chapter's understanding of what works and what fails. And why the distinction between those two things is never obvious in advance. The stories the Raptors tell each other are not stories of glorious moments. They are stories of problems that were solved correctly, and problems that were not, and what the difference between those outcomes teaches about subsequent decisions. This is a form of culture. It simply does not produce the outward warmth that other chapters' cultures produce. Because warmth is not the goal. Effectiveness is the goal, and the Raptors' culture is oriented toward producing effectiveness. Other chapters find this cold, the Blood Angels, whose culture is saturated with beauty and grief, and the specific tragedy of their Primarch's death, find the Raptors' pragmatism alien in a way that goes beyond tactical difference. The Space Wolves, whose identity is built around the bonds of the pack and the warrior's loyalty to his brothers, find the Raptors' reserved relationships functional, respectful, not warm, inadequate to the thing that the wolves believe makes a warrior willing to die for the warrior beside him. The Ultramarines, who have built the most comprehensive institutional framework in the Adeptus Astartes around the precise observance of principles derived from their Primarch's Codex, find the Raptors' willingness to depart from that codex when the situation requires it uncomfortable in a way they express as professional concern. The Raptors note all of this and adjust for it in joint operations and maintain the approach that produces the outcomes. There is a suspicion, never explicitly stated in the available records, that the Raptors are the chapter that other chapters would not want to be, but that the Imperium sometimes needs to be able to call on. The warrior that wins the war that the honourable warrior could not win, by methods the honourable warrior could not bring himself to use. The chapter that, when the mission requires the approach that makes people uncomfortable, can be relied upon to take it without the moral agony that would slow a more ceremonious force. The Raptors do not confirm or deny this characterization. They are not given to self-description in those terms, but there is a quality in their institutional self-understanding, the rejection of glory, the willingness to be misunderstood, the specific clarity about what the mission requires, and the absence of attachment to how that looks from outside. That sits uneasily alongside the question of what exactly they have signed up for in accepting the role of the chapter that does the unpleasant things efficiently. They have limits. The Raptors are loyal to the Emperor, genuinely and without the ambiguity that the Badab War's secessionists demonstrated could emerge from long independence and distance from terror. They fight for the Imperium with the same commitment that every loyal chapter does. Their ethics are not absent. They are present in a different form, organized around outcomes and the protection of the humans they are meant to protect rather than around the forms of the fighting. But the limits are real and worth naming. The Raptors use camouflage and ambush and strategic withdrawal, which are uncomfortable to other chapters. They also, if the situation demands, use approaches that other chapters would refuse on principle: the feigned alliance, the deception of an enemy, the creation of a strategic fiction that produces the tactical conditions required. These are tools most warriors would not reach for. The Raptors reach for them when the arithmetic says they produce the required result more efficiently than the alternatives. At what point does efficiency become a moral problem? That is the question that the Raptors' existence raises, and the question that neither the Raptors nor the Imperium that employs them tends to answer in direct terms. The wars get won. The warriors come home, fewer than they left, but fewer than they would have been with a different approach. The people who were going to be killed by the enemy the Raptors addressed are not killed. At what point is that sufficient? Tarangast is not widely known. This is not an accident. The Raptors keep the location of their homeworld classified below the level of most Imperial administrative record-keeping that would normally capture this information. For the same reasons they keep everything operationally sensitive classified. A secret that is not widely known is a secret that is harder for an enemy to exploit. The loss of their first homeworld demonstrated the cost of a static asset at a known location. Tarangast has been arranged, as much as a planet can be arranged, to avoid repeating that lesson. What is known about the planet is drawn from the chapter itself, and the chapter describes it obliquely and selectively. Tarangast exists in the Sutter Spiral Nebula, a region of the galaxy that is itself not heavily trafficked or particularly prominent in Imperial strategic records. The nebula provides a degree of natural concealment, as nebula matter complicates long-range sensor readings and limits the clarity of the astrographical picture for anyone looking in from outside. The Raptors occupy a planet inside it that most of the Imperium is not looking for. The planet spans a range of biomes. This is important for what the Raptors use it for. Tarangast is not a single environmental type, not the Arctic death world that produces warriors of a certain hardened resilience, not the jungle world that produces survivors of a different kind. It has extreme temperatures at both ends, multiple distinct ecological regions, conditions that require different survival strategies in different areas. A recruit raised in Tarangast's equatorial regions faces different challenges from one raised in the high latitudes, and both of them face different challenges again from the warriors who come from the mid-elevation forests. This variety is deliberate. The Raptors need warriors who can operate in multiple environments, who can adjust their tactics and their expectations to conditions that are different from the last theater they fought in. A warrior who has trained only in the jungle fights less well in the void, and less well again in the urban environment, and less well still in the desert. The Raptors' selection environment produces warriors who are not specialists in any single terrain type but are competent across all of them. Fighters whose capacity to adapt is built into their formation at the deepest level. Training itself focuses heavily on the skills the chapter values. Marksmanship, obviously, extended range engagement from concealed positions, the patience to hold a shot until the target is correctly presented, the judgment to pass on a shot that is almost right and wait for the one that is certainly right. Concealment, at a level of development that goes well beyond the standard scout curriculum that every chapter uses to bring initiates to battlefield readiness. Movement across terrain without acoustic signature, the ability to cross ground without sound, which requires a quality of physical control that is different from the strength and speed that most martial training emphasizes. And thinking. The Raptors teach their warriors to think about war in the same way they expect their warriors to think about it during a war. Analytically, with the dispassion of people who are solving a problem rather than expressing a virtue. The training scenarios they run are weighted towards situations in which the correct answer is not the obvious one, in which the first impulse would be to engage directly, and the right choice is to do something else. Warriors who learn the right answer to these scenarios too quickly, who produce the tactical solution without going through the reasoning process, are watched carefully. The goal is not an instinct for the indirect approach. The instinct can produce the wrong answer as easily as the right one. The goal is the thinking capability that arrives at the indirect approach when that approach is correct, and the direct approach when that approach is correct. There is something about the Raptors' warrior culture that other chapters members notice when they serve alongside them. The quality of individual judgment. Not simply the ability to execute orders well, every Astartes has this, but the ability to evaluate a situation independently and reach a sound tactical conclusion without waiting for instructions. The Raptors fight in conditions where communication is often compromised, where the distances between elements of a dispersed operation make real-time coordination impossible. where the warrior on the ground at the moment of decision may not have access to the commander who planned the operation. This warrior needs to be able to think for himself. Not arbitrarily, not with the kind of independence that produces inconsistency in what the larger operation produces, but with the specific kind of trained judgment that allows him to evaluate the situation against the operation's objectives. Determine what the commander would want him to do with the information he has that the commander doesn't, and act in a way that serves the objective even if the specific action was not anticipated in the plan. The Raptors train this capability explicitly. They value it in selection. The warrior who cannot think independently is less useful to the chapter than a warrior of similar physical capability who can. This creates a peculiarity in how the chapter presents itself. The warriors are individually more self-directed than most, more likely to explain the reasoning behind their actions rather than simply reporting the actions, more likely to notice and flag information that was not in the briefing. Joint operations commanders who are accustomed to Space Marines who execute rather than evaluate find Raptor warriors slightly disconcerting in this respect. The Raptors consider this a feature. A warrior who understands why he is doing what he is doing is a warrior who can continue doing the right thing when why he was told to do it changes. Tarangast produces these warriors. The chapter protects Tarangast with the kind of institutional care that values the asset without making it indispensable, and the Accipiter sits above it in orbit, ready to move if the arithmetic ever says moving is the right choice. The Raptors fight against many kinds of enemies, and the approach adapts each time. Against conventional Imperial Guard grade human forces in rebellion, the Raptors are overwhelming. This is not because they are Space Marines. Any Space Marine chapter would have the same physical advantage over infantry without equivalent augmentation. It is because the conventional military mind, even a very good one, operates within assumptions that Space Marine level opposition does not share. Conventional soldiers know that the attacking force must concentrate, that the objective must be approached from a defensible angle, that the flanks must be protected. They know what an assault looks like and they defend against what it looks like. The Raptors do not look like an assault. Not from the direction the conventional soldier is covering, not at the moment the conventional soldier is watching, not with the force distribution that the conventional defensive mind is calibrated to recognize as dangerous. By the time the rebel commander understands that the Raptors are in his position, the Raptors are in his position. The engagement is decided in the decisive sense before it is over in the physical sense. The outcome is determined at the moment of contact, and what follows is the working out of a conclusion already established. Against alien enemies, the dynamic shifts. The Xenos mind does not think like the human mind, and the tactical models that work against human opponents need to be rebuilt from their foundations when the enemy's decision-making operates on different principles. An orc mob does not have the command sensitivity that makes eliminating a rebel commander decisive. The mob's effective leadership is distributed through the hierarchy of physical dominance, and removing one element simply reorganizes the hierarchy. A tyrannid swarm does not respond to disinformation or fainting, because the hive mind processes information at a level that makes many of the psychological elements of the Raptor's approach irrelevant. Against alien enemies, the Raptors rely more heavily on the parts of their approach that do not depend on the enemy making specific psychological errors. Position and timing. The ambush that works, not because the enemy can be induced to walk into it, but because the Raptors have moved into the killing ground and held it long enough that the enemy must cross it. The disruption of command nodes in the cases where the enemy does have exploitable command hierarchies, the retreat that draws the enemy out of prepared positions and into terrain where the Raptors' dispersal and knowledge of their own movements becomes an advantage. They have fought Tyranids and Orcs and Necrons, and the creatures that the ruinous powers produce in the regions around the Eye of Terror, and the alien raiders that press on Imperial space from the dark. Each of these requires a different version of the same fundamental approach, the same intellectual framework applied to different conditions, the same patience and the same discipline, and the same willingness to find the angle of attack that the enemy did not predict. Against Chaos Space Marines, the dynamic approach is the one they faced against the Mantis warriors in the Badab War. Warriors with Astartes level capabilities and in many cases Astartes level tactical sophistication, who understand the approaches the Raptors favor and who may be watching for them. This is where the chapter's investment in adaptability and individual judgment pays dividends that no fixed tactical approach can provide. Against an enemy who is looking for the ambush, you set a different kind of trap. Against an enemy who expects the feint, you feint differently, or you make the feint into the actual attack when the enemy's response to the expected feint opens an unexpected line. Against an enemy who knows what you are, you become briefly something else. The Raptors have studied the tactical patterns of the traitor legions extensively, and their intelligence on specific warbands is developed with the same depth that they apply to any persistent enemy. A Chaos warband that the Raptors have engaged before will find the second engagement different from the first, in ways that reflect how the Raptors have integrated what the first engagement taught them. A warband that has developed a predictable pattern will find that pattern suddenly working against it, because the Raptors have been counting the pattern and are now using it. Against the Emperor's most dangerous enemies, this capacity for continuous adaptation is not a luxury. It is the difference between a chapter that remains effective and one that develops into a known quantity that the enemy has solved for. The Raptors remain effective. They work at it continuously. And the galaxy is wide and hostile and endlessly varied, which means the work never stops, and the thinking never stops, and the adaptation never stops. They would not want it to. A war that did not require them to think would not be a war worth their attention. Before the Badab War gave the wider Imperium a reason to know the Raptor's name, there was the Fourth Quadrant Rebellion. The rebellion deserves more attention than it typically receives in the Imperium's historical accounting, partly because it was substantial, a significant uprising affecting a region of Imperial space that required serious military response, and partly because the Raptors' campaign against it demonstrates their approach at what may be its clearest and most complete expression. This was Lias Issodon's emergence as a commander whose methods were worth understanding, and the methods the rebellion revealed are the methods the chapter has carried forward as its defining approach ever since. The Fourth Quadrant Rebellion was not a simple military problem. Rebellions rarely are. The straightforward military calculation: the rebel force has X strength in Y positions. The loyalist force must defeat it, tends to obscure the political and logistical infrastructure that makes the military force possible. A military that destroys the enemy's combat elements while leaving the underlying support structure intact has not ended the rebellion. It has created a pause in it, during which the structure regenerates the military force with whatever modifications it has drawn from the defeat. Issodon approached the Fourth Quadrant rebellion differently. His analysis of what sustained the rebellion, what made it possible for it to continue resisting rather than collapsing under the pressure a loyalist force could apply, identified the specific nodes that the rebellion's effectiveness depended on. Not the combat units, the logistics chains that kept those units supplied, the communication networks that allowed them to coordinate, the personalities, specific individuals within the rebellion's leadership structure, whose removal would not simply damage the organization, but would create dysfunction that the organization would struggle to compensate for. He designed a campaign around degrading those nodes. It was not a campaign of dramatic engagements. The Raptors moved through the rebellion's territory in dispersed elements, hitting the targets the intelligence had identified rather than the targets that were most visible or most militarily significant in the conventional sense. They destroyed supply depots that were not defended because no one had thought to defend supply depots. They eliminated communication relays at moments when the elimination would produce maximum confusion in the rebellion's ability to coordinate. They removed specific individuals from the rebellion's structure at moments calculated to make the removal most disruptive to the structure's functioning. The rebellion did not understand what was happening to it. Military forces that are being fought in the conventional sense know they are being fought. The engagements are visible. The losses are obvious. The pressure of the campaign can be perceived and responded to. The Fourth Quadrant rebellion experienced something different. A progressive degradation of its ability to function effectively that had no visible cause. Because the causes were not the kind of thing that a military force typically watches for. Supply shortages appeared without apparent source. Communications became unreliable without obvious reason. Decision-makers disappeared or were unable to attend critical coordination. By the time the rebellion's leadership understood what was happening to them, the campaign was already decided. Their ability to sustain organized resistance had been dismantled, and the military force that remained was now fighting without the logistical and command support it needed, which made it vulnerable to the kind of direct engagement that the Raptors had been building toward all along. The final engagements, when they came, were decisive. But the decision had been made weeks earlier. In a dozen small operations against objectives the rebellion had not thought to protect. The fighting at the end was the execution of a sentence already written. Issodon came to wider attention because commanders who had worked with the Raptors during the campaign described what they had witnessed with a combination of admiration and unease that made those descriptions memorable. The admiration was straightforward. The campaign had worked efficiently against a rebellion that had looked considerably more durable at the outset. The unease was more complex. A quality in how the campaign had worked that felt different from the kind of military excellence most senior Imperial commanders were accustomed to celebrating. The Raptors had not defeated the rebellion so much as unmade it from the inside out. They had approached it as a system to be disassembled rather than an enemy to be defeated. The distinction is significant. A defeated enemy is one that has been overcome. A disassembled system is one that no longer functions. The outcomes look similar at the end, but the route to them implies a different relationship between the warrior and his enemy, a colder, more analytical one, in which the enemy is a problem to be solved rather than an opponent to be overcome. Some commanders found this admirable, others found it troubling. Issodon, for his part, found the distinction academic. The rebellion had ended. The civilians under rebellion were no longer under rebellion. The imperial forces that would have been spent in a conventional campaign were largely intact. To him, nothing else did. The Raptors maintain good relationships with the chapters they have fought alongside. This seems like it should follow automatically from the fact of shared service. And for some chapters it does. The bonds of brotherhood extend easily beyond chapter lines when warriors have bled beside each other. For the Raptors, the mechanism is different, but the outcome is genuine. The Red Scorpions are the closest example. During the Badab War, Issodon deferred to Master Carab Cullen's command without visible resentment, despite Issodon having offered himself for the position and having a plausible claim to it based on experience and track record. What could have been a source of professional friction became instead the foundation of a lasting alliance. The Raptors and the Red Scorpions fought together across the Badab War, with a coordination that their initial structural differences would not have predicted. And the relationship that developed between the two chapters has endured since. The reason, if you examine it, is consistent with how the Raptors approach most things. Carab Cullen was appointed to command. The mission required competent execution of that command. Contesting the appointment would have degraded mission effectiveness. Contesting command served no purpose the Raptors recognized. Therefore, Issodon stepped back from the command question and worked within the arrangement that existed, which freed him to direct his attention to the tactical and operational challenges rather than the institutional one. This is not magnanimity in the traditional sense, though it produces effects that look like magnanimity. It is the same logic applied to the interpersonal political dimension of the campaign. The question is always, what actually advances the operation? Contested command does not. The answer was a Red Scorpion's chapter master in command, and a Raptor's chapter master applying his expertise at the tactical level within that structure. With institutions other than the Adeptus Astartes, the relationship is more complicated. The Raptors work well with the Inquisition, which should surprise exactly no one who understands both institutions. The Inquisition values results above most other considerations, operates with a tolerance for morally complex methods that most of the Imperium does not share, and is in the business of addressing threats that cannot be addressed through conventional military engagement. The Raptors' approach to those same kinds of threats is broadly compatible with the Inquisition's operational requirements, and the two institutions have worked together in enough situations that the working relationship is established. The administratum is more difficult. The administratum expects documentation, reporting, the kind of institutional transparency that allows the vast bureaucratic machinery of the Imperium to track what its assets are doing and confirm that they are doing it correctly. The Raptors provide this in the same minimal form that they provide everything, enough to discharge the institutional obligation without providing information about their methods and dispositions that does not need to be in the administratum's files. The administratum finds this insufficient. The Raptors find the administratum's requirements excessive relative to what the administratum does with the information it demands. The tension has been ongoing for as long as the chapter has maintained its approach. The relationship with the ecclesiarchy is formally correct and personally distant. The Raptors are loyal to the Emperor. They maintain the forms of the Imperial Creed as a matter of institutional compliance. They do not build their identity around the religious dimension of their loyalty, the chapter cult that most Astartes forces develop as the framework within which their devotion is expressed. And so the ecclesiarchy's engagement with the chapter tends to be transactional. The ecclesiarchy provides chaplain services. The Raptors accept them. Neither institution derives much from the interaction beyond what the form of it requires. None of these relationships are hostile. The Raptors do not court hostility. They are not contrarians seeking to distinguish themselves by opposition. Their reserve is not posturing. It is the natural product of an institutional culture that values doing the thing correctly over making relationships comfortable. And that tends to find the energy invested in managing impressions wasteful, relative to what that same energy invested in the operation could produce. What the Raptors need from other institutions is straightforward: the operational freedom to conduct campaigns in the way their analysis indicates is most effective, combined with the support resources, intelligence, logistics, strategic direction that they cannot efficiently generate themselves. What they offer is equally straightforward: exceptional outcomes against difficult targets at costs that consistently come in below what conventional approaches would produce. This exchange works. Not always without friction, not always without the kind of misunderstanding that different institutional cultures produce when they rub against each other. But it works. The Raptors deliver what they promise. The institutions that rely on them generally find this sufficient. The ones that do not are generally the ones that wanted something else alongside the results: admiration, clarity of method, the comfortable transparency of knowing exactly what the warriors they were relying on were doing and why. The Raptors do not provide this, and they are not going to start. The Raptors carry the gene seed of Corvus Corax, and the gene seed carries its own history. The Raven Guard's gene seed is among the more stable in the Adeptus Astartes, not without its concerns, but comparatively free of the degradations that have driven some chapters toward crisis, or created the specific biological afflictions that mark others permanently. The Raptor's gene seed produces warriors without the catastrophic flaw that defines the Blood Angels, or the Iron Hand's mechanical obsession, or the Space Wolf's gradual biological devolution. Their bodies are functional, stable, within normal parameters for Astartes operation. The specific expression of Corvus Corax's genetics in the Raptor's warriors tends toward the qualities you would predict from the chapter's philosophy: exceptional reflexes, superior vision in low light conditions, and the particular quality of stillness that the gene seed seems to encode. An ability to reduce involuntary movement and physiological noise that the Raptor's training enhances, and that makes their warriors more effective at the kind of extended concealment their doctrine requires. A space marine hiding in cover produces less signal than you would expect even from a transhuman warrior. The Raptors produce less still. The melanochromic organ, which in some chapters produces dramatic effects on skin color and eye coloration, operates without unusual expression in Raptor's warriors. They are not the pale-skinned warriors that the Raven Guard itself produces. Their gene seed has drifted enough in the generations since the second founding that the specific physical markers of the parent legion are less pronounced. Raptors warriors are as varied in appearance as the recruiting worlds they come from, which is part of why they blend into human populations more effectively than some chapters whose biological inheritance is more visibly dramatic. This lack of visual distinction matters. A blood angel moves through a human population and is noticed because the gene seed's expression in their features makes them remarkable. A Raptor's warrior in civilian dress moves through a human population and is noticed only because of his size, and size alone is a more ambiguous signal than size combined with the supernatural physical beauty of Sanguinius's gene seed. The Raptors have used this relative anonymity operationally. The warrior who can move through a city or a transit hub or an enemy-held settlement without drawing the specific alarm that visibly post-human features create. The gene seed also encodes, as Corvus Corax's inheritance encodes in all his successors, a specific relationship to psychic potential. The Raven Guard and their successors produce librarians, as all chapters do. Warriors whose psychic capability has been identified and trained. But the particular quality of the psychic gift in this gene line tends toward foresight rather than raw power. Not prophecy in the mythological sense, but the specific tactical foresight that manifests as an exceptional ability to read a battle's developing pattern and act on the reading before the pattern has fully resolved. The Raptors describe this in the informal language of the chapter rather than the formal terminology of the librarius as seeing the shape of things. It is not, in most Raptors warriors, an explicitly psychic quality. The gene seed enhances the ordinary human capacity for pattern recognition and predictive modeling to a degree that can look, from outside, like something more than human analysis. And in chapter masters like Issodon, the quality becomes so pronounced that commanders who have worked with him describe something that feels supernatural even if they cannot identify the mechanism. Whether it is the gene seed or the training, or the particular quality of a mind that has been thinking about war in the Raptors framework for decades, is not easy to separate from the outside. Possibly all three contribute. The effect is real regardless of the cause. Issodon and the senior Raptors commanders operate with a predictive accuracy about enemy behavior and battle development that exceeds what their information should allow. The gene seed also operates in the Raptors' secondary hearts and os modula and all the other organs with the same stability that characterizes their biological inheritance overall. They do not experience the mutation rates that threaten some chapters, do not produce the aberrant warriors that others must manage and contain, do not suffer the gene seed degradation that creates concerns about long-term viability. The Raptors can replenish their losses at rates commensurate with the Codex standard, which after the Badab War's casualty rates was the most immediately important quality a gene seed could have. They rebuild, steadily, without fanfare, according to the same principles of sustainability and forward planning that govern everything else they do. The chapter never falls below the threshold of effective operation. The gene seed maintains the quality it requires. The warriors produced from it carry the inheritance of Corvus Corax into the galaxy's darkest conflicts, without the biological weight that makes some chapters fight themselves as much as they fight their enemies. This is, in its own way, a form of tactical advantage. The warrior who does not carry a curse is a warrior whose entire capacity is available for the mission. Space Marine chapters fill the time between campaigns differently. Some chapter cultures are saturated with ritual, ceremonies that mark the passage of time, the observance of significant dates in the chapter's history. the religious practices that connect the warriors to their primarch and through their primarch to the emperor. Some cultivate art or craft, the specific traditions of making that ground a warrior's identity in something other than battle. Some immerse themselves in training to a degree that makes the line between campaign and inter-campaign difficult to find. The Raptors' culture between campaigns is consistent with everything else about them. It is largely intellectual. The chapter maintains a documentary tradition that is unusual in the Adeptus Astartes, in its specificity and its tone. Most chapters record their campaigns in terms that are narrative and often elevated. The heroic chronicle, the account of great battles and great warriors, the history that serves as inspiration and as mythology. The Raptors record their campaigns as case studies, after-action reports that do not read like heroic narrative but like operational assessments. The objective, the plan, the execution, the deviations from the plan, the outcomes, the lessons identified, the changes to be made in subsequent operations based on what the campaign revealed. These documents are classified, not for political reasons, not because the content would embarrass the chapter. The Raptors are not in the business of embarrassment. Because the content constitutes operational intelligence that the chapter does not want to share widely. How the Raptors approach specific kinds of enemies, what their analysis has revealed about enemy weaknesses, what the specific method produced in a specific tactical situation. This is information that has value precisely because the enemy does not have it. Sharing it broadly degrades its value. The warriors read the case studies. They discuss them. The inter-campaign culture of the Raptors is, to the extent that an outside observer can access it, a continuous seminar in applied military theory, conducted by warriors who have direct experience of the engagements being analyzed. A chapter master presents the after-action analysis of a recent campaign. Senior warriors question aspects of the planning that produced suboptimal outcomes. Alternatives are proposed and evaluated against what the campaign actually produced. The discussion is direct, even blunt, without the deference that rank typically generates in other chapters' internal culture. A warrior who has identified a flaw in the plan does not soften the identification out of respect for the commander who made the plan. The flaw is the point. Finding it is the purpose of the discussion. This takes a certain kind of institutional culture to sustain, and the Raptors sustain it through the consistent application of the principle that the mission is the standard and the plan is only as good as what it produces. A chapter master who designed a campaign that achieved the objective, but at unnecessary cost, is not evaluated by whether the objective was achieved. He is evaluated by whether the cost could have been lower, and if it could have been, the discussion identifies how. There is no glory seeking in this, but there is something that functions like satisfaction, the clean satisfaction of a problem examined and understood and addressed more correctly the next time. The Raptors find this sufficient. More than sufficient. It is what they are, and it is what they do with the time between what they are good at. And the distinction between the two activities is not as sharp as it might be in a chapter that defined itself differently. They also train, continuously with the same rigor that the intellectual culture applies to theory. The marksmanship is maintained because marksmanship requires maintenance. The skills degrade without practice, and the Raptors' standards are high enough that degradation matters. Concealment, movement, the physical capabilities that the gene seed provides are sustained and refined. The warrior who has just returned from a campaign is not a warrior at peak capability. The campaign has taken a toll, and the recovery, physical and cognitive, is managed with the same attention that the campaign itself receives. They sleep when they sleep, eat when they eat. The biological requirements of post-human existence are managed with the same efficiency as everything else. There is no romanticism about the warrior's life in the Raptor's culture, no mythology of the warrior who does not sleep, does not feel, exists entirely in the space of the combat and the preparation for it. The warrior is a system, and systems require maintenance, and the maintenance is as important as the deployment. What all of this produces across the careers of individual warriors and across the chapter's institutional development is a deepening capability that does not plateau. Most chapters produce warriors who reach a level of excellence and maintain it. The veteran warrior who is as good as he will become, sustained at that level by training and experience. Raptors, warriors continue to develop throughout their careers, because the chapter's culture does not allow for a plateau. There is always the next analysis, the next case study, the next modification of approach. There is always something that could be done better. The warriors who carry this culture for decades become something remarkable, not the celebrated heroes that other chapters produce. Something that functions more like the sharpened edge of a blade that has been maintained past the point of ordinary sharpness. The galaxy does not always celebrate what it should value, but the galaxy encounters the blade when it needs to be cut. Brotherhood in the Raptors does not look like brotherhood in the Blood Angels, or the Space Wolves, or the Ultramarines. The Wolves' brotherhood is warm and demonstrative and built into the pack culture that Fenris produces. The relationship between pack brothers that is expressed through loyalty that is as emotional as it is functional. Through the shared mythologies of great hunts and the long night. Through the specific Fenrisian understanding of community as the basis of individual identity. The wolves are their pack. Without the pack, they are fragments. The Blood Angels carry their brotherhood through grief, the shared weight of the curse, the knowledge that any brother may fall to the rage and must be honored in his falling, the specific intimacy of warriors who know each other's most dangerous internal life and who choose to stand beside each other anyway. Their brotherhood is forged in the presence of the thing that can destroy them, and it has a depth that specific pressure creates. The Raptor's brotherhood is operational. This is not an insult. Operational brotherhood, the bond formed between warriors who depend on each other for survival, who have built the mutual knowledge of each other's capabilities and instincts that makes a small unit function as something other than a collection of individuals, is a real and significant thing. It is not shallow. It is simply organized differently from the bonds that mythology and ceremony produce. A Raptor's warrior knows his brothers in the way that matters most when your life depends on the knowledge, their capabilities, their judgment under pressure, the way they make decisions when the plan has changed and there is no time for consultation. The tells that appear when someone is operating at the edge of what they can manage and needs support they might not ask for. This knowledge is accumulated through the campaigns they have fought together and through the shared culture that makes those campaigns the basis of ongoing professional conversation. Warriors who have been on the same deployment talk about what happened in the same direct, unvarnished way that the after-action reports are written, what the situation was, what each of them did, what it produced, and what the combined assessment is of whether it was the right call. There is intimacy in this. Different from what other chapters call intimacy, but present. The warrior who can tell you exactly where you made the wrong decision in a firefight 6 months ago, and why, and what the alternative would have produced, knows you more precisely than many warriors whose relationship to their brothers is expressed through shared ceremony but not through this kind of detailed professional engagement. The Raptors do not produce the legendary friendships that other chapters celebrate, the famous brotherhoods of specific named warriors, the relationships that get commemorated in chapter mythology. They produce something quieter and more pervasive. The general trust that comes from serving in a culture that rewards competence and judgment consistently. Where the warrior beside you has passed the same standards and processes information through the same professional framework, there is a comfort in that trust that does not announce itself in the way that more ceremonious bonds do, but that holds under pressure in ways that bonds built on ceremony sometimes do not. They do not leave each other behind. This is perhaps the most important expression of brotherhood in the Raptors, and the one that looks most familiar when compared to other chapters' cultures. A withdrawal does not mean abandoning the warriors who cannot withdraw. A tactical retreat is planned to preserve the force, which includes the wounded. That discipline has its limits here. Limits the arithmetic does not override. The warrior who can be recovered is recovered, even when the cost of recovery is high. Because the cost of not recovering him is the message it sends about what belonging to the chapter means. And they trust Issodon, not with the reverence that some chapters direct toward their chapter masters, not as a mythological figure, not as the living embodiment of the Primarch, not as the patriarch of an institution that defines their identity through him. They trust him as the sharpest mind in a chapter of exceptional thinkers, as the commander who has consistently made the decisions that produce the outcomes, and who has accepted the costs of wrong calls without deflecting them onto the warriors who executed the wrong calls faithfully. He is the most competent person in the room. In a chapter that values competence above almost everything else, this produces its own form of loyalty. That loyalty has held through the Badab War's casualties, through the grinding demands of the Indomitus Crusade's dispersed deployments, through every situation in which a chapter with a different kind of culture might have fractured under the pressure. The Raptors' brotherhood is not the most visible thing about them. It is quietly among the most durable. The Great Rift changed the Imperium's strategic situation in ways that no prior planning had fully accounted for. The cicatrix maledictum, the wound across the sky, the great scar of chaos that tore the galaxy in half and left billions of worlds isolated, cut off from the Astronomicon, drowning in the dark, presented every institution of the Imperium with a crisis for which existing doctrine was inadequate. The Rift was not an enemy that could be engaged. It was a new condition, a restructuring of the fundamental parameters within which the Imperium operated, executed by powers that did not care about the Imperium's response, and that could not be reached through any available military option. What the Imperium could do was respond to what the Rift had enabled, the alien threats that took advantage of the disruption, the heretical forces that poured through the opening the Rift created, the isolated worlds that needed contact and support and in many cases active military assistance, the new front lines that the Rift's geography had created without the Imperium having chosen their locations. Rabut Gilliman returned to find this. The Primarch who had written the Codex Astartes, and who had been absent from the Imperium for 10,000 years, came back to an institution that had changed enormously and a strategic situation that was more acute than any in the Imperium's post-heresy history. He assembled the Indomitus Crusade, the military response to the Rift's consequences, a multi-fleet operation of enormous scale aimed at stabilizing what could be stabilized and reaching worlds that the Rift had isolated. He wanted the Raptors. The request came to Issodon in terms that were, reportedly, more specific than the general call to arms that the Indomitus Crusade generated. Guilliman understood what the Raptors were. The Lord Commander had reviewed the chapter's history and spoken with commanders who had worked with them, and the understanding he arrived at was of a force that would be valuable not in the mass assault phase of the Crusade, but in everything else. The scouting. The establishment of contact with isolated worlds before the main fleet elements arrived. The identification of the most acute threats in the Crusade's path, and the disruption of those threats before the Crusade's forces encountered them at full strength. Issodon agreed to contribute strike forces to 3 of the Crusade's fleets: Fleet Primus, Fleet Secundus, Fleet Tertius. This was a significant commitment. 3 simultaneous detachments from a chapter that was not among the largest in the Adeptus Astartes, operating in 3 different regions of a galaxy that had become considerably more hostile than it had been. The logistics required to support dispersed operations of this scale were not trivial, and the command burden of monitoring 3 separate deployments while maintaining the chapter's other obligations was real. The Raptors made the commitment anyway. The arithmetic said it was the right commitment. The Indomitus Crusade needed what the Raptors could provide, and the Raptors were positioned at the northern edge of the Segmentum Solar in a way that made them among the first chapters to respond to Guilliman's call. Contributing to 3 fleets rather than 1 was the kind of decision that reflected the Raptors' general willingness to accept difficult commitments that serve the mission, even when the difficulty is real. Fleet Primus received the most documented of the Raptor contributions. Lieutenant Soranis led a strike force as the forward scouts for Battle Group Orpheus, operating on the fringes of the Great Rift, where the Rift's influence made the territory unpredictable and the threats irregular. Eldar Corsairs were active in these fringes, raiders exploiting the disruption the Rift had caused in the same way that every other power with the capability to exploit disruption was doing so. Soranis' force engaged them with the approach the Raptors had used against irregular enemies for centuries: intelligence gathering, position, and the strike at the moment and from the angle that the Corsairs were not watching. The Eldar Corsairs are not simple enemies. They move quickly, they see widely, they have access to psychic senses that most enemies cannot match, and that complicate the standard Raptor's approach of remaining undetected until the moment of engagement. Corsairs who feel something wrong will be gone before the wrong thing manifests physically. The force that relies on surprise against them needs to be aware that the surprise itself may be perceived before it can be executed. Soranis' operation addressed this. The intelligence gathered before the engagement identified the specific Corsair band's patterns, where they moved, when with what regularity, and in what configurations. The engagement that followed exploited a moment when the Corsair pattern put their key leadership element in a position where even their psychic early warning would not provide sufficient time to withdraw before contact. The result was not a complete elimination of the threat, but a disruption significant enough that the Corsair band's ability to operate against Battle Group Orpheus' flank was substantially degraded. Across 3 fleets, dispersed across the galaxy's new geography, the Raptors did what they had always done. The galaxy was worse than it had been. The threats were more varied and more acute. The conditions for the kind of careful, methodical approach the chapter favored were harder to create in a strategic environment that was changing faster than any campaign intelligence could keep pace with. They adapted. They always adapt. The galaxy that the Raptors operate in now is harder than the galaxy they were founded in. This is not a statement unique to the Raptors. Every institution in the Imperium faces a more difficult strategic situation than their predecessors did. And the trend over 10,000 years has been consistently toward worse rather than better. But in the specific current era, in the years after the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half, and the Indomitus Crusade pushed back against the immediate consequences, the difficulty has intensified in ways that the Raptors' particular approach is both well-suited and severely tested by. The dispersal of threats is greater. The Rift has created conditions in which the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Half, cut off from the Astronomican's light, is fighting dozens of crises simultaneously with limited ability to coordinate resources between them. The Raptors' deployment across 3 Indomitus Crusade fleets addressed part of this. But 3 fleets in a galaxy that needs dozens of interventions is not a complete solution. The chapter's warriors are spread thinly in ways that the original strategic planning for the Raptors' modest force size did not anticipate. The intelligence environment is harder. Pre-Rift, the Raptors' network of intelligence gathering was built on an Imperium that, however slowly, communicated between its parts. Reports flowed. Eventually, the picture of what was happening in a given region could be assembled from multiple sources with sufficient patience. In Imperium Nihilus, those channels are unreliable at best and absent at worst. The Raptors' intelligence is being built from what their own elements can gather, rather than what the wider network produces, and the picture that results is necessarily less complete. Against these difficulties, their strengths hold. The capacity to operate in isolation, small units, high autonomy, the ability to make correct decisions without a command hierarchy above them, is exactly the capacity that the Rift's disruption makes most valuable. The warrior who can assess a situation with incomplete information and reach a sound conclusion is not a luxury in the current era. He is the basic requirement for survival in a region of the galaxy where complete information is not available, and where waiting for it to arrive would mean not operating at all. The Primaris Marines whom Guilliman brought to the Indomitus Crusade have also arrived in the Raptors' ranks. This is not frictionless. The Raptors' culture is built on a specific approach to war-making that is taught and reinforced over careers, and warriors who arrive from the Primaris program, however biologically formidable, however well-trained in the general Astartes tradition, do not arrive already knowing how to be Raptors. They need to be integrated into the chapter's reasoning culture, the scouting tradition, the specific expectations that the chapter's approach creates for individual warrior judgment. The Raptors have absorbed them, not by softening the expectations. The expectations are what they are, and the chapter's effectiveness depends on the standards being maintained. But by integrating the Primaris through the same process that has always produced Raptors warriors, the case studies, the after-action analysis, the training scenarios that emphasize intellectual capability alongside martial excellence, warriors who go through this process become Raptors. The biology does not resist it. What the Primaris bring that the Raptors value is what every new warrior brings: fresh capabilities that the chapter can incorporate, and a perspective unconstrained by the specific assumptions that long service in a single tradition can produce. The Raptors watch their new warriors closely, not to evaluate whether they are performing correctly, but to see whether they notice things that the established tradition misses. Sometimes they do. The observation goes into the analysis, and in the field, in whatever form the current era presents, the Tau expansion pressing on contested territories, the Necron tombs awakening in the galaxy's restructured geography, the chaos forces that pour through the rift in numbers that the strategic picture struggles to contain, the Tyrannid hive fleets that the rift's disruption has, if anything, made more dangerous by reducing the coherence of the Imperial response. The Raptors operate. Moving early, gathering information before committing, finding the command nodes and the supply chains and the communication networks that hold the enemy's effort together, and methodically dismantling them before the enemy understands that dismantling is what is happening. They are effective in conditions that have made everything harder, in a strategic situation that does not simplify, and that the chapter's planning cannot predict with the confidence it would prefer. They continue to produce outcomes that the situations require. Not without cost. Never without cost. The current era is spending warriors that will take time to replace, and the Raptors are managing their losses with the same careful accounting they bring to all resource constraints. But the work continues. The analysis continues. The galaxy presents problems and the Raptors generate solutions, patient and thorough and in the shadows where the enemy is not looking. It has always been this way. As long as the Raptors exist, it will continue to be. The Raptors pay costs. This needs to be said clearly, because the description of an approach that emphasizes minimizing losses can create a misimpression that the Raptors fight clean wars, that their methods insulate them from the attrition that other chapters accept as the standard price of the standard approach. They do not. The Badab War demonstrated this in the most direct possible way. 35 to 60% of deployed strength lost in a war that the chapter entered with sophisticated planning and well-developed intelligence. The Arius Vex destroyed. Warriors who had served for decades gone. The Raptors reduce losses below what a less intelligent approach would produce. They do not eliminate losses. No force that fights in the wars the Imperium needs fighting eliminates losses. The galaxy is too hostile, and the enemies too capable, and the strategic situations too complex for any doctrine to achieve victories without cost. What doctrine determines is the cost relative to the objective, and the cost relative to what the same objective would have required with a different approach. The comparison is always the counterfactual. What would this have cost if we had done it differently? That comparison is never available with certainty. The battle that did not happen, the casualties that did not occur, are not in the record. What the Raptors can demonstrate is outcomes, mission achievement rates, comparison of their deployed force against the force they faced, the ratio of their losses to the losses they inflicted. These numbers are in their records. They consistently suggest that their methods produce results that more conventional approaches could not at comparable cost. But the cost is real, and the warriors who pay it are real. And the chapter feels this in ways that its external reserve does not always communicate. The Raptors grieve, They do it quietly, and they process it functionally, the loss turned into the lesson. The fallen warrior's experience fed back into the institutional memory that shapes subsequent planning. But the warriors who did not come back were people, were brothers, in whatever sense the Raptors use that word, which is more reserved than most chapters, but not absent. A chapter that processes loss entirely without feeling would not be a chapter capable of the kind of commitment that the Raptors bring to the mission. You cannot care enough about the mission to accept the risks it requires if you cannot feel the weight of what those risks cost when they materialize. The Raptors' restraint in expressing this is not indifference. It is the specific discipline of a culture that does not allow grief to become debilitating, because the next mission does not wait for grief to run its course. The Badab War's casualties represent the deepest cut in the chapter's modern history. Recovering from them required years of sustained recruitment and training before the chapter was operating at the strength levels it maintains as standard. During that recovery, the Raptors could not accept every commitment that would otherwise have come their way. They were rebuilding, not reduced to nothing, but limited. And the chapter managed the limitation with the same hard honesty it brings to every other resource constraint, honestly without pretending to a capability they did not have, accepting fewer deployments while the rebuilding was completed. There is something in this that other chapters find almost more striking than the tactics. The willingness to say, clearly and without the institutional pride that makes such statements difficult, we have taken losses that limit our current capacity. We are rebuilding. We will be available for the following commitments in the following time frame. A chapter that can be honest about its own limitations in this way is a chapter that other commanders can plan around accurately, which is a different kind of strategic asset from the warrior glory that produces less reliable availability. The Raptors rebuild. The gene seed provides the biological foundation. The training produces the warriors. The culture ensures that the warriors produced are shaped by the lessons of the losses rather than simply added to a roster. And then they deploy again with fewer illusions than before, and with the specific weight of what the Badab War added to the institutional memory, and with the understanding integrated into the planning at the foundational level, that the Mantis warriors had taught them something they had not known they needed to learn. The next time the Raptors encountered an enemy with their own tactical profile, that encounter went differently. Not easier. The Raptors do not expect anything to be easy, and they are suspicious of situations that feel easy because those situations are usually not what they appear, but differently. With the adjustments that the Gargathea system experience had prompted, applied to the specific problems that the new encounter presented, the lesson was expensive. The application of the lesson was worth the expense. That is, in the end, the accounting that the Raptors live by. Not whether the cost was high, but whether what the cost produced justified the expenditure. If it did, the expenditure was correct, however painful. If it did not, the next plan will be better. There is no other arithmetic that matters. Every Space Marine chapter trains scouts. It is fundamental to the institution, the novitiate phase, the period between the gene seed implantation and the completion of the transformation process, during which the young warrior learns to fight in the field with capabilities that are already exceptional, but not yet fully developed. Scouts are lighter infantry, operating with fewer augmentations active and without the full plate armor that distinguishes the Space Marine, but they serve a function beyond the training role. They are the chapter's eyes at range, the elements that operate ahead of the main force in roles the full battle brother is too heavily augmented to fill discreetly. In most chapters, this function phases out over time. The scout becomes a battle brother, the armor goes on. The scout's role is absorbed into the broader tactical framework of a fully armored Space Marine force that can afford to be seen because its capability makes concealment less necessary. In the Raptors, the scout's function never entirely phases out. It evolves. The Raptors maintain a scouting tradition that persists well into the careers of fully augmented warriors. Battle brothers who have worn power armor for decades will, when the mission requires it, remove it. Not because the armor is not available, it is, but because the mission is better served by a warrior in lighter equipment who can do things the armored warrior cannot. The psychological weight of this in most chapters would be significant. Astartes' power armor is not simply protective equipment. It carries identity, history, the accumulated significance of the warrior's service. Taking it off is, for most warriors, not a neutral act. The Raptors are trained from their earliest initiation to be comfortable without the armor in a way that most chapters are not, because their doctrine makes that comfort operationally necessary. The warrior who cannot function effectively in lighter equipment is the warrior who cannot do what the Raptors' most important missions require. And so the training never loses the scout's capabilities, never allows the scouting tradition to become purely a novitiate phase, always maintains the expectation that a fully formed Raptors warrior can shed the marks of his station and operate at ranges and in conditions that standard battle brother deployment does not allow. This has practical implications that extend well beyond the individual warrior. The Raptors' capacity for pre-battle intelligence gathering exceeds any other chapters in the Adeptus Astartes, because they can put fully augmented warriors in positions that other chapters' augmented warriors would not be able to reach without being detected. The veteran warrior who has survived decades of campaigning and whose tactical judgment is accordingly developed, now conducting reconnaissance operations that would normally be performed by novitiates. The quality of what that warrior observes and how he interprets it is fundamentally different from what a novitiate produces. The information comes back more complete. The analysis comes back more sophisticated. The mission planning that is built from it is accordingly more accurate. The combat operations that are built from the mission planning are accordingly more effective. It cascades. The investment in maintaining the scouting capability across the chapter's career span produces compounding returns throughout the planning and execution process. This is understood within the Raptors as simply how the chapter functions. From outside, it reads as an unusual and somewhat disconcerting willingness to have the most experienced warriors in the chapter operating in conditions that seem beneath their station. There is no beneath station concept in the Raptors' culture for operational roles. The role that serves the mission is the correct role. The warrior who refuses a role because it seems inappropriate to his rank is the warrior whose pride is interfering with the outcome. The Raptors manage the interference by not having the pride in the form that produces it. The Scout Marines proper, the actual novitiates in the Scout role, work alongside these veteran elements in ways that create a different kind of training dynamic than most chapters produce. The novitiate who learns from a veteran who is actively conducting the same operations is not learning theory about how the scout role works. He is learning from direct observation of how an experienced warrior conducts the role. The transfer of tacit knowledge, the things that cannot be explained in a training program but can be absorbed from watching an expert work, is more complete than in a system where the veteran is solely a trainer. The Raptors have been building this culture for centuries. Its refinements over that time are not documented in materials available outside the chapter, but the outcomes are visible in every engagement the chapter conducts. Their situational awareness at the moment of engagement exceeds what their numbers would suggest. Their command of ground, their timing, their understanding of the enemy's disposition before the first shot. These qualities are built from the intelligence that their scouting tradition produces, maintained to a standard that their scouting tradition's quality makes possible. It is not the most dramatic gift the Raven Guard's gene seed has given them. Corvus Corax's children do not have a curse, do not have a burning rage, do not have the specific extraordinary quality that makes other chapters' mythology dramatic. They have the ability to move through darkness without being seen, and to arrive where they are most useful when they are most needed. And from that ability, carefully developed over centuries, they have built everything else. The Raptors exist at the edge of a question the Adeptus Astartes has never fully answered. The question is not about loyalty. The Raptors are loyal. Not in the performative sense, not through the elaborate ritual affirmations of devotion that chapter cult practice provides, but in the most fundamental sense of placing the mission above everything else. And the mission is the Imperium's survival, and the Imperium's survival is the Emperor's project. And the Emperor's project is what Space Marines exist to serve. The Raptors serve it as directly and as effectively as any chapter in the Adeptus Astartes. The question is about what a Space Marine should be, not what a Space Marine should do, which the Codex Astartes addresses in considerable detail, and which the Raptors mostly observe in the structural sense. What a Space Marine should be as an entity. What the transformation that creates a warrior from a human child is supposed to produce, beyond the biological and martial capabilities. What the culture that the chapters build around their warriors is supposed to accomplish, beyond the maintenance of effective fighting units. The dominant answer in the Adeptus Astartes has been something like, a warrior who embodies the virtues of the chapter's gene line Primarch, expressed through the culture that the chapter has developed around his inheritance, in service of the Emperor, whose project the Primarch served. The Blood Angel is Sanguinius's son in the fullest sense, carrying his gifts and his curse, shaped by his death, animated by his tragedy. The Space Wolf is Russ's son, carrying the pack bonds of Fenris and the warrior glory of the Great Hunts. The Ultramarine is Guilliman's son, methodical and ordered and devoted to the excellence that the Codex prescribes. The Raptors are Corvus Corax's sons, and their answer to what a Space Marine should be reflects that inheritance in the most direct possible way. A warrior who is effective. Not a warrior who embodies a set of virtues that are valued independently of their outcomes. A warrior who produces the results the situation requires, by whatever means the situation permits, at the lowest possible cost. This is a more stripped-down answer than most chapters are comfortable with. It removes the layers of mythological and cultural significance that make being a Space Marine feel like something beyond being a very effective soldier. And it raises a question that the stripped-down version cannot avoid. If the point is effectiveness, what constrains the means? If outcomes are the standard, what is ruled out? The Raptors are not monsters. The constraints exist. They will not harm civilians to achieve a military objective. They will not betray the Imperium they serve. They maintain the fundamental ethical commitments that define what a chapter in the Emperor's service means, and those commitments are not for sale to the efficiency that another approach would have produced. But beyond those constraints, the means are open. And the openness is not always comfortable for an institution that has spent 10,000 years defining its identity partly through the things it will not do. The Space Marines of the Imperium are not only a military force, they are a mythology. The warrior in full plate charging across open ground does not only defeat the enemy facing him, he means something to the people watching, to the Imperial Guard soldiers who follow behind the Space Marine advance, to the civilian populations who learn that Space Marines were present in the defense of their world. The presence of the Adeptus Astartes is a statement about what the Imperium values and what it is capable of producing, and what it will do in the defense of humanity. The warrior who fights magnificently contributes to all of this. The Raptors' victories produced different meanings. A war that ended before it reached its most expensive phase. Because the right nodes were disrupted before the war could get there, the civilians whose world that war did not destroy do not always know what preserved them. The ambush that eliminated the enemy commander before the battle that the commander was about to launch. The troops who were not committed to that battle do not know how close they came to being committed. The strategic withdrawal that preserved a fighting force that subsequently turned and destroyed the pursuing enemy. The warriors who survived because they withdrew rather than stood feel something about the withdrawal. The Raptors produce real military value that the mythology does not capture, because the mythology requires the visible engagement to exist. They are saving lives that the record does not count as saved, because the record counts only what happened rather than what would have happened without the Raptors in the picture. This matters. Not because the Raptors seek the recognition, they do not. And this is clearly demonstrated by the entire trajectory of the chapter's history, but because the Imperium's institutions make decisions about what to value. And what the institutions value shapes what gets maintained and supported and how the available resources are distributed. An institution that cannot see the value of what the Raptors do will systematically under-support them, and an Imperium that does not adequately support warriors who fight smarter will get the wars it deserves. The Raptors have a definition of victory that differs from the standard military one. The standard definition is the one that gets written into after-action reports and Crusade histories. The objective was achieved. The enemy force was destroyed or routed. The world was reclaimed or the insurgency was suppressed. These are binary outcomes. The battle happened, and then it was over, and then one side or the other had won it. The Raptors evaluate victory by a different measure. Not was the objective achieved, but was the objective achieved at the right cost. Not was the enemy destroyed, but was the enemy destroyed in a way that did not create a successor threat, deplete assets needed for the next engagement, or commit the chapter to positions it cannot subsequently exit without loss. The outcome is only half of what matters. How the outcome was produced is the other half. This makes the Raptors' internal accounting of their campaigns more complex than most chapter records reveal. A battle that produced the required outcome but required higher casualties than a different approach would have produced is not, in the Raptors' institutional evaluation, an unqualified success. It is a success with a lesson attached. The lesson being why the higher cost was incurred and what could have been done differently to incur less. The lesson is not filed and forgotten. It goes into the case study archive. It gets discussed. It produces adjustment. And a campaign that withdrew before the stated objective was achieved because the analysis indicated the objective was no longer worth the cost required to achieve it, this is not automatically a failure in the Raptors' accounting. If the withdrawal preserved the force for a subsequent operation that achieved more at lower cost, the series of decisions may represent better overall performance than a campaign that had achieved the objective by grinding through it. This frustrates joint commanders who need to report outcomes to higher authority. The administratum wants to know whether the world was reclaimed or not. It does not have a form, for we did not reclaim the world, but we reduced the enemy's capacity to hold adjacent worlds by 60% at a fraction of the cost of reclamation, and subsequent operations in the region will benefit. The Raptors' assessment of their own performance is simply not legible in the language that Imperial reporting infrastructure uses. They prepare two versions of every after-action summary. One in the language the reporting infrastructure requires, the objectives achieved or not achieved, the force disposition at the end of the engagement, the casualties and material losses on both sides, and one in the language the chapter actually uses, the full internal accounting, the cost versus objective evaluation, the lessons identified, the adjustments to be made. The external version goes to whoever is entitled to see it. The internal version stays with the chapter. This gap between the external account and the internal one is not dishonesty. The external account contains no falsehoods, but it also contains only a fraction of what the Raptors know about the campaign, the part that the reporting framework can accommodate. The rest, the richer and more accurate picture of what happened and why and what it means for what comes next, is the Raptors alone. Most chapters do not maintain this distinction in the same explicit way. Their internal and external accounts of a campaign are broadly the same, because their evaluation of success uses the same criteria the external account uses. For the Raptors, the distinction is structural. Their concept of victory is not the one that the Crusade record celebrates, and so their own accounting of their victories necessarily lives in a different document. There are things the Raptors do that do not appear in the official record. This is not unique to them. The Adeptus Astartes in general does not operate transparently. The nature of the chapter's operations, the classified classification of their methods and their intelligence, the oath of silence that the Death Watch requires, the broader institutional culture of the Space Marines as an organization that reports to the Emperor through structures that do not always include the administrative, machinery that tracks most of the Imperium's activities. All of this means that what Space Marine chapters do in practice and what appears in the record can diverge significantly. With the Raptors, the divergence may be wider than with most. What can be inferred from the patterns in what is recorded, the outcomes, the timelines, the character of conflicts that the Raptors have been involved in, and their speed of resolution relative to what they should have required, points toward methods that the record is silent about. The rebellion that collapsed faster than the military situation could account for. The enemy commander whose sudden death preceded an engagement that did not happen. The ally who appears in the record at a position that they should not have been able to reach before the conflict reached that phase. The inference available from these patterns is not comfortable. It points toward the use of methods that Space Marine doctrine does not formally include. Not because the methods are unavailable or because the Raptors lack the capability, but because the methods require a willingness to be what the mythology cannot accommodate. The warrior who enters a situation as something other than a warrior, who represents himself as what he is not in order to gain access to a position that would not otherwise be available, who acts in a way that achieves the mission at the cost of, not atrocity, not the kind of moral catastrophe that the most extreme methods produce, but the kind of thing that other warriors, asked directly, would say they would not do. The Raptors do not confirm this. They do not deny it. The classified records that would contain the evidence of it are not available to the people who would ask the questions the evidence raises. What can be said is this. In the Raptors framework, the restraints on means are defined by the mission's requirements and the ethical floor below which the chapter does not go. Below that floor, the Raptors will not go regardless of what the operation might seem to require. There are things they will not do, and those things remain stable even when pure logic would seem to justify them. Above that floor, the means are evaluated by what they produce rather than by whether they are comfortable to describe. This is not the same as having no limits. It is having limits defined differently from the way most of the Adeptus Astartes defines them. For most chapters, the limits are cultural and ceremonial as much as ethical. The things that are ruled out because a Space Marine does not do them, because the warrior tradition does not include them, because doing them would mean being something other than a Space Marine. For the Raptors, the limits are ethical and pragmatic. The things that are ruled out because they produce consequences the mission cannot absorb, or because they cross lines that the chapter has decided represent the boundary of what the mission justifies. Whether those two approaches arrive at the same list of prohibited methods is not entirely clear. The evidence suggests there are things the Raptors do that other chapters' cultural limits would rule out. Whether those things cross the ethical limit is a question the Raptors have answered in their own analysis, and the answer they have arrived at is that they do not. The question of whether they have arrived at the correct answer is the one that the Inquisition watches them with enough attention to be asking. The Inquisition watches, and the Raptors continue operating, and the missions get done. The silence that surrounds certain operations is maintained. The records that do not exist continue not existing. And somewhere in the operational history of the chapter, in the missions that are not in the record and the outcomes that are, there is the full accounting of what the Raptors are willing to become in service of the mission they believe is worth it. Most institutions prefer not to look directly at this kind of accounting. The Raptors have made it their business to look directly at everything. What they see when they look is something they have decided they can live with. The warriors of other chapters, presented with the same view, might decide differently. That is the edge the Raptors occupy. Not comfortably, not in a way that the chapter's culture celebrates, but deliberately, with full understanding of what it means to be the force that does what is required, when what is required is not what the mythology allows. The galaxy does not get better if the force willing to make that decision does not exist. Whether the force that makes that decision is better for making it is a different question, and one the Raptors have perhaps decided is not the most productive one to ask. The weapons the Raptors carry are telling, not in the sense of armament that is unusual by Space Marine standards. The bolter, the chainsaw, the melter gun, the various tools of the trade are present across the Raptors' arsenals as they are across every chapter's. What is telling is the proportion. The weight of the load out toward ranged and precision engagement. The number of sniper variants. The absence of the siege equipment and the heavy, close assault weapons that other chapters invest in for the kinds of engagements those chapters favor. The Raptor's arsenal reflects the doctrine with the same fidelity that the doctrine reflects the gene seed. Precision-ranged weapons are abundant because the Raptors engage at ranges that allow them to choose the engagement. Close assault weapons are present but not dominant, because close assault is what happens when the ranged phase did not produce the outcome it was supposed to produce, and when the ranged phase is properly executed against a properly identified target at a properly chosen moment. The close assault is often not required. Their vehicles are similarly weighted toward mobility and concealment over armor and fire support. Bikes and jump infantry for rapid repositioning. Light vehicles that can be placed in concealment and moved quickly when the tactical picture changes. Not the heavy land raiders and siege vehicles that anchor a position and defend it, but the tools for a force that is not planning to anchor itself in the first place. The chapter's standard tactical doctrine for the opening of an engagement involves reconnaissance elements that are already in place before the main force commits. These are not simply scouts pushed out ahead of an advancing formation. They are established observation positions, sometimes occupied for days before the main engagement begins, that have built the intelligence picture that the main force will operate from. The warriors in these positions are selected not only for their scouting capability, but for their judgment. Their ability to identify what the intelligence picture is telling them. To notice what the enemy's dispositions are changing toward, and to communicate that change to the main force in time for the main force to adjust. This communication infrastructure is something the Raptors invest in carefully. The systems that allow dispersed elements to maintain coordination without producing the electronic signature that gives away position. A problem that affects all Space Marine forces operating covertly, but that the Raptors face acutely given how much of their doctrine depends on dispersed concealed elements maintaining shared awareness. The solutions are not simple, and the Raptors' approach to them has been refined over centuries. Periodic brief transmissions rather than continuous links. Pre-arranged signal systems that do not require radio. The specific use of terrain and positioning that allows visual communication between elements that cannot use electronic means. This is not glamorous work. It does not produce the stories that chapter myths are made of. It produces the operational conditions that allow the chapter to fight the way it fights, which is the thing the chapter values above the stories. The warriors who master these skills are not celebrated. They are simply the baseline. The Raptor's baseline is unusually high because the chapter has been selecting for and training to it for the chapter's entire history. What this has produced over the long arc of that history is a force that does not age in the way that chapters sometimes age. that does not develop the complacencies and the over-reliance on proven methods that long institutional success can produce. The Raptors' culture resists this actively. Through the after-action culture that keeps revisiting conclusions and the thinking framework that treats current effectiveness as a starting point rather than an achievement. They are still getting better. After centuries of doing this, they are still finding the ways in which their previous approach was not quite right, and the adjustments that make the next approach slightly more correct. This is the most unusual thing about them, and possibly the most important. Most institutions improve until they plateau. The Raptors' plateau, if it exists, is not yet in sight. The Imperium of man has survived for 10,000 years. This is the fact that everything else hangs on. Whatever the Imperium has become, whatever its failures and its corruptions and the distance between what it was supposed to be and what it is, it has survived. The alien has not consumed it. Chaos has not unmade it. The heresy, which should have ended it, did not end it. The 10,000 years of relentless assault from every direction, the attrition of worlds and populations and resources on a scale that would have destroyed any human institution that could not draw on the extraordinary assets the Imperium has maintained. None of it has been enough to finish what it started. The Space Marines are central to this survival, not the only factor, not the sufficient cause, but the force that has held the most dangerous fronts when nothing else could hold them, that has been the decisive element in the conflicts where the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Without the Adeptus Astartes, the Imperium does not survive the heresy, does not survive the War of the Beast, does not survive the Black Crusades or the Great Rift or the dozen other existential crises that the galaxy has produced in the time since the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne. Within the Adeptus Astartes, the Raptors occupy a position that is specific and underappreciated, and that the Imperium would be considerably poorer without. Not the most celebrated chapter, not the chapter that gets mentioned first in discussions of the Imperium's finest warriors. They do not produce the moments that fill crusade records or the propaganda that the Ministorum uses to inspire the faithful. Their chapter master does not give speeches that are quoted afterward. Their victories are often classified. What they produce is outcomes. Sustained, repeatable, efficient outcomes against targets that the outcomes needed to be produced against. Conflicts resolved at costs below what the same resolution should have required. Enemies destroyed in campaigns that move through their phases faster than the enemy expected, because the Raptors had already been working on the campaign before the enemy knew it had started. There is a particular lonely discipline required to be the Raptors, to do the work that does not appear in the record, to win battles that the Imperium never celebrates, because the Imperium never knows quite which battles it is celebrating when the Raptors have finished with them, to watch the visible warriors, the Ultramarines in their blue, the Blood Angels in their gold, the Space Wolves with their banners and their sagas, receive the recognition for victories in wars that the Raptors' preceding operations made possible, and to accept this without resentment, because resentment would require caring about the recognition. The Raptors do not care about the recognition. This is perhaps the clearest proof of how completely the chapter has integrated its own doctrine. Because the warriors who genuinely do not care about glory are the warriors who have internalized at the deepest level the distinction between the appearance of effectiveness and effectiveness itself. You cannot fake not caring about recognition. If the caring is there, the appearance of not caring is just a better disciplined form of the same vanity. The Raptor's indifference to glory is structural. It is built from the same operational logic that everything else is built from. The consistent conclusion that glory contributes nothing to the objective, and therefore does not belong in the accounting. 10,000 years of this has kept the Raptors from the destruction that has reduced some chapters to shadows of themselves and eliminated others entirely. The Badab War's casualties were severe and were recovered from. The loss of the original homeworld was total and was adapted to the demands of the current era, in which the Imperium is more fragile and more under pressure than at any point since the heresy, are being addressed with the same methodical analysis and the same willingness to take the difficult approach rather than the familiar one. The galaxy continues to change. The rift has created new strategic conditions. The Primarchs who have returned have brought new capabilities and new complications. The enemies the Raptors face are not static. They learn, they adapt, they produce new versions of the threats that previous analysis has addressed and develop new threats that previous analysis did not anticipate. The Raptors adapt alongside them. This is not a quality that most chapters could easily maintain across the same time frame. Adaptability at institutional scale, the willingness to change not just the tactics, but the analytical framework that produces the tactics, requires a culture that values the correct answer over the consistent one, that never becomes so attached to its own previous conclusions that new evidence cannot revise them. Most human institutions, under sustained pressure over sufficient time, calcify. They arrive at conclusions that worked, and they maintain those conclusions, because the conclusions are part of their identity. The Raptors do not have the kind of identity that calcifies in this way. Their identity is the process, the analysis, the adaptation, the constant revision of conclusions in light of what the evidence actually says. You cannot calcify a process. You can only maintain it or abandon it, and the Raptors have not abandoned it in the chapter's entire history. Somewhere in the galaxy right now, Lias Issodon is planning something. The dark eyes are still, the face is still, but the thinking is continuous, and the thinking is being applied to a problem that the enemy has not yet realized is in the process of being solved. Warriors in olive armor are in positions they were not expected to occupy. Information is accumulating that the enemy does not know is being gathered. The shape of the next engagement is being determined by choices being made now, weeks before the engagement arrives. In the patient, methodical language of a chapter that has always understood that the battle is won before the battle begins. The Space Marines are supposed to fight in a certain way. The charge, the banner, the magnificent statement of what humanity's finest warriors are capable of, and what they will do in humanity's defense. The Raptors fight differently, and in the dark, in the positions the enemy was not watching, in the operations that are not in the record and the victories that are, the galaxy is a little safer than it would be without them. Whether it deserves them is another question. The galaxy does not in general deserve the forces that fight for it. But the Raptors are not fighting for the galaxy they deserve. They are fighting for the one they have. And they are very, very good at it.